Eleanor Whitmore stood before the town council, her hands trembling with barely contained fury. "You're rejecting my curriculum because I teach science?" Her voice cut through the stuffy room like a blade. 6 men shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her eyes. "Miss Whitmore," the mayor cleared his throat, "it's not proper for a woman to know so much. Makes the menfolk uncomfortable. Makes you—" He paused. "Unmarriageable." The word hung in the air like a verdict. At 26, Eleanor had committed the unforgivable sin of being too educated, too intelligent, too much for any man in Arizona territory to handle. Stay with me through this journey of a woman who refused to shrink and the unexpected man who asked her to grow. Like this video and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The dust of Salvation Springs, Arizona territory never truly settled. It hung in the air like the town's judgment, perpetual, suffocating, inescapable. Eleanor Whitmore had learned to breathe through it, just as she'd learned to breathe through the whispers that followed her down Main Street every afternoon when school let out. "There she goes," old Mrs. Henderson would mutter from her porch, loud enough to be heard. "Poor thing. All those books and not a husband in sight." Eleanor kept her spine straight, her eyes forward, her leather satchel heavy with the contraband that had sealed her fate. Mathematics texts, volumes of natural philosophy, anatomical drawings, and most damning of all, Charles Darwin's work, carefully hidden between the pages of more acceptable literature. She was 26 years old in the year 1875, which made her a spinster by frontier standards. But it wasn't age that had relegated her to the margins of marriageability. It was knowledge. The schoolhouse sat at the eastern edge of town, a simple wooden structure that Eleanor had transformed into her sanctuary. Inside these walls, she was not too much. She was exactly enough. The children who filled the worn benches each morning didn't care that she could recite Latin declensions or explain the mathematics behind bridge construction. They simply wanted to learn, their minds open in ways their parents would never be again. "Miss Whitmore?" 8-year-old Samuel Tucker raised his hand, his freckled face scrunched in concentration. "If the earth is really round, like you said, why don't the people on the bottom fall off?" Eleanor smiled, setting down her chalk. This was the question she'd been waiting for, the one that would open doors in their young minds. "Excellent question, Samuel. Who here can help him reason through this?" Before anyone could answer, the schoolhouse door banged open. Eleanor's heart sank. She recognized the heavy footsteps, the particular quality of entitled anger that preceded Tobias Caldwell into any room. "Children," she said calmly, though her pulse had begun to race, "please open your readers to page 47 and practice your comprehension silently." Tobias Caldwell was the mayor's nephew, a man of 32 who owned the largest dry goods store in Salvation Springs. He was also, unfortunately, the town's most persistent suitor where Eleanor was concerned, though suitor implied a romantic interest that simply didn't exist. What Tobias wanted was a wife who would elevate his social standing, and a schoolteacher, even an unmarriageable one, still carried a certain prestige. "Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor said coolly, moving to intercept him before he could reach her desk, "school is in session. Unless you have children enrolled here, I must ask you to— I've just come from the town council meeting." His face was flushed. Whether from the heat or from anger, Eleanor couldn't tell. "They've made their decision about your curriculum proposals." Eleanor felt her stomach drop, but she kept her expression neutral. Behind her, 20 pairs of young eyes watched with the intensity children reserve for moments when adults forget they're being observed. "And?" she asked quietly. "Rejected. All of it." Tobias's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The advanced mathematics, the natural sciences, that Darwin nonsense, all rejected. You're to stick to reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and moral instruction, as it should be." Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides. She'd spent 3 months preparing that curriculum, carefully researching, documenting every lesson plan, anticipating every objection. She'd been so certain that if she could just present the material properly, show them how education could transform their children's futures. On what grounds? Her voice was steady, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "On the grounds that it's inappropriate." Tobias took a step closer, lowering his voice. Eleanor, you have to understand. People are talking. A woman with your interests, it's not natural. It's not seemly. The council is concerned about what you're teaching these children. More importantly, his voice dropped to what he probably thought was a persuasive tone. They're concerned about you. Concerned, Eleanor repeated flatly. You're isolated, unmarried. It's not good for a woman to spend so much time alone with books, filling her head with ideas that can't possibly be of use to her. You need Mr. Caldwell. Eleanor's voice cut through his words like winter ice. I need you to leave my schoolhouse. Now. I'm trying to help you. His voice rose, frustration breaking through his veneer of concern. For God's sake, Eleanor, I've offered you a solution. Marry me. Give up this foolishness. You could run the store's bookkeeping, manage the household, have a respectable position in this town. Instead, you insist on making yourself a pariah with all this. He gestured wildly at her desk where a geology text lay open beside her lesson plans. This unwomanly obsession with subjects that don't concern you. The schoolroom had gone silent. Even the dust motes seemed to hang suspended, waiting. Eleanor drew herself up to her full height, 5 feet and 6 inches of barely contained fury. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, precise, and absolutely unshakable. Mr. Caldwell, I would rather spend the rest of my life alone with my unwomanly obsessions than spend a single day married to a man who considers my mind an obstacle to be overcome. Now get out of my schoolhouse before I have you removed. Tobias's face went purple. You'll regret this. You think you're too good for this town, too smart for the people here, but you're just a dried-up spinster playing at being a scholar, and everyone knows it. You'll end up alone, Eleanor. Alone and forgotten, because no real man wants a woman who thinks she's smarter than he is. He turned and strode out, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Eleanor stood perfectly still, her heart hammering, her hands shaking with suppressed rage and something deeper, a fear she rarely acknowledged, even to herself. Because what if he was right? Not about her unworthiness, but about the inevitable loneliness that seemed to be her destiny. Miss Whitmore? It was little Sarah Chen, one of her brightest students, whose parents ran the town's laundry. Are you all right? Eleanor turned and 20 concerned faces looked back at her. These children, she reminded herself, were why she endured the whispers, the rejection, the casual cruelty of men like Tobias Caldwell. These children, with their curious minds and unlimited potential, were worth every sacrifice. I'm fine, Sarah. Thank you for asking. She managed to smile. Now then, Samuel asked an excellent question about gravity before we were interrupted. Who would like to help him explore that? The rest of the school day passed in a blur of lessons and recitations, but Eleanor's mind kept returning to the council's rejection. It wasn't just about the curriculum. It was about control, about keeping her in her place, about ensuring that the next generation of Salvation Springs children remained as narrow-minded and limited as their parents. When the final bell rang and the children scattered into the dusty afternoon, Eleanor sat at her desk and allowed herself a moment of despair. She pulled out the letter she'd received 3 weeks ago, the one she'd read so many times she'd nearly memorized it. Dear Miss Whitmore, the Boston Ladies Educational Society has reviewed your submission with great interest. Your paper on innovative teaching methodologies in frontier education demonstrates both scholarly rigor and practical application. We would be honored to publish your work in our quarterly journal and invite you to present at our annual symposium this October. Furthermore, we understand you may be seeking new opportunities. Several of our member institutions are actively recruiting qualified instructors for their academies. Should you be interested in relocating to Boston, we would be pleased to facilitate introductions. Boston, a city where women could attend lectures, visit libraries, engage in intellectual discourse without being labeled unmarriageable. A city where her education would be an asset, not a liability. But Boston was also 3,000 miles away from the children who needed her, from the desert landscape she'd come to love despite everything, from the life she'd built here, even if it was a lonely one. Eleanor was still holding the letter when she heard hoofbeats outside, followed by the creak of the schoolhouse door opening. We're closed for the day, she called out without looking up. assuming it was another parent come to complain about her teaching methods. "I can see that, ma'am. Just looking for a map if you've got one." The voice was unfamiliar, deep, with the slow drawl of someone who'd spent more time under open sky than under a roof. Eleanor looked up and found herself face to face with a man unlike any she'd encountered in Salvation Springs. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the lean, weathered build of someone who made their living on horseback. Dust coated his clothes, and his hat was stained with sweat and age. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray-blue, sharp with intelligence, and completely without the judgment she'd grown so accustomed to seeing in men's faces. "A map?" Eleanor repeated, her scholarly instincts immediately engaged. "Of what region?" "North Territory, up toward Canyon de Chelly. We're running cattle through, and the usual trails are dried up. Need to find water sources." He took off his hat, revealing sun-bleached hair that might have been dark blonde before months under the Arizona sun. "Name's Lucas Reed. I'm with the drive camped outside town." Eleanor rose from her desk, her earlier despair momentarily forgotten in the face of an intellectual challenge. "Canyon de Chelly? You're taking cattle through Navajo territory?" "With permission," Lucas said quickly. "We've got agreements with the local leaders, but the land's changed since the last drive 5 years ago. Droughts move things around." Eleanor moved to the cabinet where she kept her maps. Proper geological survey maps that she'd painstakingly copied from library books and government documents. She spread one across a student's desk, and Lucas stepped closer to examine it. "You made this?" There was genuine surprise in his voice. "I copied it from source materials and added notations based on travelers' accounts and indigenous knowledge where I could verify it." Eleanor traced a route with her finger. "The usual trail here is indeed problematic. The springs at Red Rock Mesa are seasonal and likely dry this time of year. But if you angle northwest here, there's a series of natural cisterns that hold water year-round. The Navajo use them for their sheep." Lucas leaned over the map, studying it with an intensity that reminded Eleanor of her best students. "These elevation markers, you calculated these yourself?" "Based on triangulation and traveler reports, yes. They're not perfectly precise, but they're accurate within a reasonable margin of error." "That's remarkable," Lucas said, and there wasn't a trace of condescension in his voice, just honest appreciation. "How'd you learn to do this?" Eleanor blinked, uncertain how to respond to genuine interest rather than suspicion or mockery. "I studied surveying techniques from a military manual and some geological text. The mathematics involved are quite fascinating, actually." She stopped herself, waiting for the familiar glazed expression, the polite but firm change of subject that always came when she ventured too far into intellectual territory. But Lucas just nodded. "I'd imagine they would be. I can read land pretty well from horseback, but I've always wondered about the science behind it, how you'd translate what you see into something you could put on paper like this." Something unexpected happened in Eleanor's chest, a flutter of hope she'd learned to suppress. Would you like me to explain it?" "I'd be grateful," Lucas said simply, "if you've got the time." And so, as the afternoon sun slanted through the schoolhouse windows, Eleanor found herself explaining coordinate systems and topographical representation to a cattle drover who listened with the kind of focused attention she'd only ever received from children. Lucas asked questions, good questions, the kind that showed he was thinking rather than just being polite. "So these contour lines," he said, pointing to the map, "they show elevation changes. Closer together means steeper terrain." "Exactly. Which means here," Eleanor indicated a section of the map, "you'd want to be cautious. The approach looks gradual, but these lines suggest a sudden drop that might not be visible until you're on it." "Could have used this information on our last drive," Lucas said ruefully. "Lost 2 steers to a ravine we didn't see coming." He studied the map for another long moment, then looked up at Eleanor with something like wonder. "This is incredible work, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor Whitmore. Miss Whitmore." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Eleanor shook it. His grip was firm, his palm calloused from years of rope and rain. "I'm grateful for your help. Would it be possible to copy this map? I'd be happy to pay—" "No need for payment," Eleanor said quickly. "But I could make you a copy tonight. When do you need it?" "We're pulling out day after tomorrow at dawn. But I wouldn't want to impose on your time. It's no imposition. The words came out more eagerly than she'd intended. I enjoy the work, and it's useful to know the maps are helping someone navigate safely. Lucas smiled, and it transformed his weathered face. Then I'm doubly grateful. Should I come by tomorrow afternoon? That would be fine. He replaced his hat, nodding respectfully. Until tomorrow, then, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor watched him leave, then turned back to her desk where the Boston letter still lay. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than resignation about her future. It was a small thing, perhaps, one conversation with a passing cowboy who'd actually listened when she talked about mathematics and geography. But it was enough to remind her that somewhere in the world there might be people who wouldn't see her education as a character flaw. That evening, Eleanor worked late by lamplight, carefully copying the map and adding additional notations that might be useful to Lucas and his crew. She marked water sources, noted areas where the terrain might be treacherous for cattle, indicated spots where the Navajo had established seasonal camps in case the drovers needed assistance. As she worked, she thought about the day's events, Tobias's cruel words, the council's rejection, and then Lucas's unexpected interest in her knowledge. It was a strange counterpoint, a reminder that the world was larger than Salvation Springs, more varied than the narrow-minded men who ran this town. She was still working when she heard a knock at her door. Eleanor rose cautiously. It was nearly 9 o'clock, late for visitors in a town that rose with the sun. "Who is it?" "It's Margaret Chen, Miss Whitmore." "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Eleanor opened the door to find Sarah's mother standing on her porch, a covered basket in her hands. Margaret Chen was a small, sturdy woman who'd immigrated from Canton 10 years ago with her husband. They ran the town's laundry with quiet efficiency, enduring the casual racism of Salvation Springs with dignity that Eleanor deeply admired. "Mrs. Chen, please come in. Is everything all right? Is Sarah—" "Sarah is fine," Margaret said, entering the small quarters Eleanor kept behind the schoolhouse. "She came home today very upset about what happened with Mr. Caldwell. She made me promise to bring you these." She uncovered the basket, revealing still warm dumplings. "She said you looked sad, and dumplings make sadness smaller." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "That's very kind. Please thank Sarah for me." Margaret set the basket down but didn't immediately leave. Instead, she studied Eleanor with sharp, knowing eyes. "My daughter learns more in your classroom than reading and arithmetic, Miss Whitmore. She learns that a woman can be intelligent, that knowledge is not a thing to be ashamed of, that being different does not mean being wrong." "Mrs. Chen, in my country, I was educated," Margaret continued. "My father believed daughters deserved learning same as sons. I could read, write, keep accounts. It is why my husband chose me as wife. He needed partner who could help build business in new country. But here," she gestured vaguely at the world beyond the schoolhouse walls, "here, people see only Chinese laundry women. They do not see the person who reads their newspapers after they discard them, who understands their politics and their economics better than they think." Eleanor nodded slowly. "It's lonely, isn't it, being invisible to people who think they see you clearly?" "Very lonely," Margaret agreed, "but also freeing. When people think you are less than you are, you can be more without them noticing." She moved toward the door, then paused. "The council rejected your curriculum today, yes?" "Yes. But they cannot reject what you teach if they do not know you are teaching it." Margaret's eyes glinted with quiet rebellion. "My Sarah knows about gravity now, Miss Whitmore, and about mathematics beyond arithmetic. She knows because you teach with words they do not recognize as learning. You hide education inside stories, inside questions, inside wonder." After Margaret left, Eleanor sat with the basket of dumplings and thought about invisibility and rebellion, about teaching revolution in whispers. She thought about Lucas Reed's genuine interest in her maps, about Sarah's concern for her sadness, about Margaret's quiet acknowledgement of shared struggle. Perhaps she wasn't as alone as Tobias Caldwell wanted her to believe. The next afternoon, Lucas returned for his map. Eleanor had prepared 2 copies, one showing the route to Canyon de Chelly, another showing the broader territory in case the drive needed to adjust their path. "This is far more than I expected," Lucas said, examining the detailed notations. Miss Whitmore, this must have taken you hours. It was interesting work, Eleanor said truthfully. I don't often get to apply practical cartography. Most of my mapping is theoretical, for teaching purposes. Lucas looked up from the maps. You teach cartography? To children? Among other things. Geography, basic astronomy, mathematics, natural history when I can manage it. She couldn't quite keep the bitterness from her voice. Though the town council prefers I stick to reading and moral instruction. Their loss, Lucas said with such casual certainty that Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Though I suppose it's the children's loss, really. World's changing fast. The young people who understand science and mathematics will be the ones who shape what comes next. You sound like you've thought about this, Eleanor observed. Lucas shrugged, rolling up the maps carefully. I've been running cattle for 12 years now. Started when I was 18 with nothing but a horse and a willingness to work. I can read land, read weather, read cattle better than most men with twice my experience, but I can't read books very well. Never had much schooling. He met her eyes directly. I've thought a lot about what I might have done differently if I'd had a teacher who made learning seem like something worth doing instead of something to be endured. Is that why you came back? Eleanor asked. You could have taken the map yesterday. A slow smile crossed Lucas's face. Partly. And partly because I was curious. About what? About a woman who makes maps for strangers without asking for payment, who teaches children about gravity when their parents want them kept ignorant, who stands up to men like that Caldwell fellow. I heard about that around town, and doesn't back down even when it costs her. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm not brave. I'm just stubborn. Same thing sometimes, Lucas said. He hesitated, then continued, Miss Whitmore, we're camped outside town for one more night before we head north. The crew's having a fire tonight, nothing fancy, just coffee and conversation. Would you consider joining us? Some of the men have questions about the route, and I think they'd benefit from hearing your explanations firsthand. Every rule of propriety Eleanor had ever learned screamed at her to decline. Unmarried women did not visit cattle camps. They did not socialize unchaperoned with cowboys. They certainly did not engage in evening conversations with men they'd only just met. But Eleanor was tired of rules written by people who wanted to keep her small. What time? She asked. Surprise and pleasure flickered across Lucas's face. Sunset? I'll come fetch you if that's proper. That would be fine. That evening, as Eleanor walked beside Lucas toward the camp outside town, she felt the weight of watching eyes. Salvation Springs was a small community where everyone noticed everything, and her departure with the cattle drover would be the subject of breakfast conversation for days to come. Let them talk, she thought with a defiance that surprised her. She was already unmarriageable. What did she have left to lose? The cattle camp was exactly what she'd expected. A dozen men gathered around a fire, bedrolls spread in a rough circle, horses picketed nearby. What she hadn't expected was the respectful way they greeted her, removing their hats, offering her the best seat near the fire, treating her like an honored guest rather than an oddity. Men, this is Miss Eleanor Whitmore, the school teacher I told you about. She's the one who made our new maps. A weathered man with gray at his temples nodded appreciatively. That's fine work, miss. Haven't seen detail like that outside of military surveys. Thank you, Mr. Jennings, trail boss for this outfit. He gestured to the others, introducing them one by one. Eleanor tried to memorize names and faces, noting the mix of ages and backgrounds, including 2 Mexican vaqueros and 1 black cowboy who introduced himself as Samuel Washington. Lucas says you can explain the science of finding water, Samuel said. That true? And just like that, Eleanor found herself teaching again. But this time her students were grown men who'd spent their lives reading the land through experience, and the exchange of knowledge flowed both ways. She explained groundwater tables and geological formations that indicated springs, and they shared practical wisdom about tracking game to water sources, reading vegetation patterns, interpreting weather signs. See, that's what I've been trying to tell these boys, Jennings said, after Eleanor explained why certain types of cottonwood trees indicated year-round water. It's not magic or luck. There's reasons behind everything in nature, if you know how to look. My grandfather taught me to read land, one of the vaqueros said. But he learned from his grandfather. None of us knew the why of it, just the what. This, he gestured to Eleanor, this makes the old knowledge make sense. As the evening wore on and the fire burned down to coals, the conversation drifted from geography to stories of the trail, to questions about life in Salvation Springs, to Eleanor's careful explanations of why she loved teaching despite the town's resistance. Seems foolish to me, Samuel said, shaking his head. World needs smart people. Needs people who ask questions and figure things out. Why would anyone want less of that? Because knowledge is power, Eleanor said quietly. And some people are more interested in maintaining their power than in progress. Lucas, who'd been mostly silent, letting her interact with his crew, spoke up. What will you do when the council restricts your teaching further? Because men like that don't stop at one victory. It was the question Eleanor had been avoiding. I don't know, she admitted. I received an offer from Boston, a teaching position at a girls' academy. Better pay, intellectual community, freedom to teach what I want. But, Lucas prompted gently, but the children here need education more than the privileged girls of Boston. And despite everything, I love this landscape, this territory, the possibility of what it could become. She stared into the fire. Leaving feels like surrender. Staying feels like slow suffocation. I don't know which choice is braver. Maybe there's a third choice, Jennings suggested. One you haven't seen yet. Eleanor smiled sadly. Perhaps, but I haven't found it. The evening ended with Lucas walking her back to the schoolhouse, both of them quiet under a sky brilliant with stars. Your men are remarkable, Eleanor said as they reached her door. They're good people, hard workers. Most of them have seen enough of the world to know that education and intelligence come in many forms, from many unexpected places. Lucas paused. Thank you for tonight, Miss Whitmore. It meant a lot to them, to all of us. It meant a lot to me as well, Eleanor said truthfully. It's rare that I get to share knowledge with people who genuinely want to learn. Lucas looked like he wanted to say something more, but instead he just touched the brim of his hat. We head out at dawn, but I hope, that is, if we come through again next season, I hope I might call on you. Continue these conversations. I'd like that, Eleanor said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. She watched him walk back toward the camp, then entered her small quarters and lit a lamp. The Boston letter still lay on her desk, but now it was joined by her carefully drawn maps, by the memory of intelligent questions and respectful attention, by the possibility that somewhere beyond Salvation Springs there were people who would value her for exactly who she was. Eleanor didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt something stirring inside her that wasn't despair or resignation. It was smaller than hope, too fragile to name yet, but it was enough to keep her moving forward. Dawn came too quickly. Eleanor woke to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the jingle of harnesses, the low calls of men preparing for the trail. She rose and dressed quietly, then stood at her window watching the dust rise as the herd began to move north. She told herself it was foolish to feel this sense of loss over a man she'd known for barely 2 days. Lucas Reed was a cattle drover, a man whose life was measured in miles and seasons, not in the fixed permanence of towns and teaching positions. Their paths had crossed briefly, meaningfully, and now they would diverge as such paths always did. Yet, as she prepared for the school day, Eleanor found herself moving through her morning routine with an odd awareness of absence, as though something that had briefly illuminated her small world had been extinguished, leaving the shadows deeper than before. The children arrived with their usual morning energy, and Eleanor pushed aside her melancholy to focus on the day's lessons. But she'd barely begun the morning recitations when the schoolhouse door opened and Tobias Caldwell entered, followed by his uncle, Mayor Henderson, and 2 other council members. Eleanor's students fell silent, sensing trouble with the instinct children have for adult discord. Mr. Mayor, Eleanor said evenly, though her heart had begun to race. To what do I owe this visit? Mayor Henderson had the grace to look uncomfortable. Miss Whitmore, we need to have a word with you, in private. Eleanor glanced at her students, then back at the mayor. I'm in the middle of lessons. Whatever you need to discuss can wait until... It cannot wait. Tobias's voice was sharp with triumph. Your behavior last night was completely inappropriate, and the council has decided immediate action is necessary. Ice flooded Eleanor's veins. Children, she said quietly, maintaining her composure, please take out your slates and practice your multiplication tables. I'll return shortly. She stepped outside with the 4 men, closing the door behind her. The morning sun was already hot, promising another scorching day. Now then, she said, crossing her arms, what is this about? You were seen leaving town yesterday evening with one of those cattle drovers, Councilmember Roberts said, his jowly face flushed with indignation. Unchaperoned, you spent the evening at their camp in the company of a dozen men with no regard for propriety or your reputation. I was discussing geography and water sources, Eleanor said flatly. They had questions about the route north. I provided expertise. In the evening, Tobias interjected, alone with men you'd only just met. Eleanor, even you must see how this looks. The school teacher, who's supposed to be a moral example to the children, behaving like a— Careful, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to something dangerous. Very careful how you finish that sentence. Mayor Henderson held up his hands. Now let's all remain calm. Miss Whitmore, I'm sure you meant no harm, but you must understand that appearances matter in a town like this. Parents trust us, trust you with their children's education and moral development. When you engage in behavior that appears questionable, it reflects poorly on the school, on the council, on the entire community. I visited a cattle camp to discuss cartography with professional drovers, Eleanor said through gritted teeth. There was nothing immoral or improper about it. Every man there treated me with complete respect. The conversation was entirely professional and educational. That may be, Roberts said, but it doesn't change how it looks. Several prominent families have already expressed concern about your judgment. The Caldwells, the Hendersons, the families who are already looking for reasons to object to my teaching, Eleanor interrupted. The same families who rejected my curriculum proposals. This isn't about propriety. This is about control. This is about maintaining standards, Tobias snapped. Standards you seem determined to flout at every opportunity. You refuse to conduct yourself as a proper lady should. You insist on teaching subjects beyond your station. You reject suitable marriage proposals in favor of your books and your maps and your unwomanly pursuits. And now you've been seen cavorting with transient laborers. They were not transient laborers. They were professional cattlemen engaged in legitimate commerce. And I was not cavorting. I was teaching, which is my job, which is what you pay me to do. We pay you to teach children their letters and numbers, Mayor Henderson said, not to gallivant around with cowboys discussing science and maps. Eleanor felt something snap inside her, some final thread of patience that had been fraying since the day she'd arrived in Salvation Springs. No, she said quietly, you don't pay me to teach. You pay me to keep your children occupied and quiet while you convince yourselves you're providing them with education. But actual education, the kind that opens minds and builds futures, that terrifies you. Because educated children ask questions. They challenge assumptions. They might even grow up to realize that the way you've always done things isn't the only way, or even the best way. Miss Whitmore, the mayor began. I'm not finished. Eleanor's voice shook, but not with fear, with fury. You rejected my curriculum because you're afraid of science. You criticize my character because I dare to use my education. And now you're here threatening my position because I spent an evening sharing knowledge with people who actually wanted to learn. Well, let me make this very simple for you. Either I teach properly, using the methods and materials I know to be effective, or you can find yourselves another school teacher. The 4 men stared at her in shock. Tobias recovered first. You're giving the council an ultimatum? He laughed, sharp and mean. Eleanor, you're in no position to make demands. This is the only teaching job within 200 miles. You have no family, no prospects, no options except what we're willing to give you. So I suggest you reconsider your tone and remember your place. My place, Eleanor repeated softly. Then, louder, with absolute clarity, my place is wherever I choose it to be, and it's no longer here. She turned and walked back into the schoolhouse, her hands shaking but her spine straight. 20 pairs of eyes watched her cross to her desk. She could hear the men arguing outside. Tobias's raised voice insisting she couldn't be serious, the mayor trying to calm the situation. Miss Whitmore. Little Samuel's voice was uncertain. Are you leaving? Eleanor looked at her students, at Sarah Chen's worried face, at Samuel Tucker's confusion, at the row of children who'd been learning to love learning because she'd made it magical and meaningful. Her heart cracked. I don't know yet, Samuel, she said honestly, but whatever happens, I want you all to remember something. Being smart is not a flaw. Asking questions is not inappropriate. And anyone who tells you to make yourself smaller to make them more comfortable is wrong. Do you understand? Sarah raised her hand. What if making ourselves bigger makes people angry? Then they were always going to be angry, Eleanor said. Because people who need you to be small are afraid of what you might become if you're allowed to grow. The door opened again. Only Mayor Henderson entered this time, looking older and more tired than he had minutes before. Miss Whitmore, he said heavily, the council has decided to suspend you pending a formal review of your conduct and teaching methods. You're to vacate the schoolhouse by the end of the week. Eleanor had known it was coming, but the reality still hit like a physical blow. I see. For what it's worth, Henderson continued, not meeting her eyes, I think you're a fine teacher. My grandson talks about your lessons all the time. But this town, we're not ready for the kind of changes you want to make. Maybe we never will be. Then this town will stay small and frightened, Eleanor said. And in 20 years, you'll wonder why all your brightest children left for places where their intelligence was valued instead of punished. Henderson sighed. Maybe so. You have until Friday to collect your things. After he left, Eleanor stood before her classroom and made herself smile. Well then, we have 3 more days together. Let's make them count. And for 3 days, Eleanor taught like she'd never taught before. She abandoned all pretense of the approved curriculum and gave her students everything she had. They studied astronomy and mapped the stars. They calculated mathematical probabilities using games and puzzles. They discussed geology and evolution, history and philosophy, poetry and science. Parents began pulling their children from school by the 2nd day. By the 3rd, Eleanor had only 7 students left, Sarah Chen, Samuel Tucker, and 5 others whose families either supported her or were too poor to care what she taught as long as their children were supervised during working hours. Miss Whitmore, Sarah said on that final afternoon, where will you go? Eleanor had been asking herself the same question. The Boston letter was her obvious answer, but Boston felt like retreat, like admitting that the frontier wasn't ready for women like her, that she needed the shelter of Eastern civilization to survive. I'm not certain yet, she admitted, but wherever I go, I'll keep teaching, and I'll think of you all often. Will you write to us? Samuel asked. Tell us what you're learning. The idea struck Eleanor like lightning. Better than that. I'll send you lessons, reading materials, mathematics problems, science experiments you can do at home. If your parents allow it, I'll continue your education by correspondence. The hope that blossomed on their faces made her decision feel less like exile and more like evolution. That evening, Eleanor began packing her belongings, books mostly, teaching materials, her precious maps and charts. She was wrapping her telescope carefully in cloth when she heard horses outside. Multiple riders, which was unusual for Salvation Springs after dark. She opened the door to find Lucas Reed standing on her porch, trail dust still on his clothes, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Miss Whitmore, he said, I heard what happened. We were 2 days north when word caught up with us through some passing traders. I came back as soon as I could. Eleanor stared at him, unable to process what his presence meant. You rode back? You left your herd? Left Jennings in charge. He's been running cattle longer than I have, anyway. Lucas removed his hat, turning it in his hands. I came back because what happened to you, it's my fault. If I hadn't asked you to visit our camp, if I'd thought about how this town might react... Stop. Eleanor's voice was firm. This isn't your fault. This has been building since the day I arrived in Salvation Springs. You were just the excuse they needed. Still feels like my fault, Lucas said. What will you do now? Eleanor gestured helplessly at her half-packed belongings. I have an offer from Boston, a teaching position at a girls' academy. It's the sensible choice. But? Lucas asked, hearing the hesitation in her voice. But I don't want sensible, Eleanor said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. I want meaningful. I want to teach children who need education, not privileged girls who'll abandon it the moment they marry. I want to be somewhere that's growing and changing, where knowledge can actually make a difference. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words came slowly, carefully, as though he was testing each one before releasing it into the world. The cattle drive I'm on. It's not just a job for me. I'm a partner in the operation. Been saving for 5 years to buy land up north near Canyon de Chelly. Good water, good grass, room to build something permanent. He met her eyes. I'm planning to start a ranch, not just for cattle, but for people. There's families up there, scattered homesteads, Navajo settlements. Good people who need a lot of things, including a school. Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. Lucas, hear me out, he said quickly. I know we've only known each other a few days. I know this is sudden and probably crazy. But I've been thinking about this the whole ride north and the whole ride back. What if you came north with us? Not as my wife, he added hastily, color rising in his weathered cheeks. Unless you wanted that eventually, but as a teacher. A partner in building something new. I could provide land for a school, help with construction, make sure you had what you needed. You could teach anyone who wanted to learn, children, adults, doesn't matter. No counsel to answer to, no narrow-minded fools telling you what you can and cannot teach. Eleanor couldn't breathe. The offer was extraordinary, impossible, everything she'd ever wanted and nothing she'd ever imagined. You're offering me land and freedom in exchange for what? She asked. There has to be something you want from this arrangement. Lucas smiled, small and genuine. I want to learn. I want to know all the things you tried to teach me with those maps. I want to understand the science behind the world I live in. And I want to build something, a community, a place where intelligence is valued, where people help each other grow instead of holding each other back. He paused. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't hoping that someday, if you came to care for me the way I'm beginning to care for you, we might build something more personal too. But that would be your choice, in your time. No pressure, no expectations. Eleanor turned away, pressing her hands to her face. It was too much, too fast. She barely knew this man. The idea of leaving everything, traveling into unsettled territory, starting a school with no resources and no guarantees, it was madness. It was also the most exciting possibility she'd ever been offered. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course. Lucas backed toward the door. I'm staying at the boarding house tonight. We head north again tomorrow afternoon. If you decide to come, I'll be honored to have you. If you decide Boston is the wiser choice, I'll understand that too. After he left, Eleanor sat among her packed belongings and tried to think rationally. Boston meant security, respectability, a guaranteed position. Lucas's offer meant uncertainty, hardship, the very real possibility of failure. But Boston also meant teaching girls who didn't need her, living in someone else's established world, following someone else's rules. Lucas's offer meant creating something new, teaching people who desperately needed education, building a life on her own terms. She pulled out paper and pen, making 2 lists. Reasons to go to Boston. Reasons to go north. The Boston list was longer, more logical, filled with practical considerations. The northern list had only 3 items: freedom, purpose, possibility. Eleanor stared at those 3 words for a long time. She was still staring at them when Sarah Chen appeared at her window, tapping softly on the glass. Eleanor let her in, surprised to see the girl out so late. My mother sent me, Sarah said, slightly breathless from running. She heard about the Cowboy's offer. Half the town heard. He asked about you at the boarding house, and Mrs. Patterson listened through the wall and told everyone at the general store. Eleanor groaned. Of course the whole town knew. Privacy was a fantasy in Salvation Springs. My mother wanted me to tell you something, Sarah continued. She said to remember what she told you before, about being invisible letting you be free. She said Boston will make you visible but trapped. The North will make you free but hard. She said choose hard, because you're strong enough for hard, but you'll die slowly in a trap, even a pretty one. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Your mother is a very wise woman. She also sent dumplings, Sarah said, producing a small basket. She says courage is easier on a full stomach. After Sarah left, Eleanor ate the dumplings slowly, thinking about Margaret Chen's quiet wisdom, about the difference between visibility and freedom, about pretty traps and hard possibilities. By the time she finished eating, her decision was made. She found Lucas at the boarding house just after dawn, already preparing his horse for the ride north. "I'll need 3 days to settle my affairs here," she said without preamble. "And I'll want a written agreement about the school, land rights, building materials, autonomy over curriculum. I'll also need assurance that if this arrangement doesn't work, I'll have resources to relocate independently." Lucas's face broke into a smile that rivaled the sunrise. "Done. All of it. I'll have Jennings draw up papers. He's better with legal language than I am. And I'm not making any promises about marriage," Eleanor continued. "If that develops, it develops naturally. I won't be pressed or persuaded." "Understood completely. And I want to learn to ride properly. If I'm going to live in cattle country, I should know how to handle a horse." "I'll teach you everything I know," Lucas said. "Just like you'll teach me everything you know. Fair trade." Eleanor extended her hand. "Partners, then." Lucas shook it solemnly. "Partners." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor sold her furniture to the boarding house, packed her books and teaching materials into trunks, and wrote letters to her students explaining where she was going and promising to send lessons. She donated her telescope to Samuel Tucker's family, knowing his curiosity would put it to good use. The town's reaction to her departure was mixed. Some people, mostly the council members and their allies, were smugly satisfied to see her go. Others, like Margaret Chen and a handful of other families, were quietly supportive, wishing her well and thanking her for what she'd taught their children. Tobias Caldwell cornered her on her second-to-last day, his face mottled with anger and something that might have been genuine hurt. "You're really doing this," he said, "throwing away respectability to run off with some drifter you barely know." "I'm accepting a business partnership that will allow me to continue my work without interference," Eleanor corrected. "There's a difference." "He'll use you," Tobias insisted. "Men like that always do. He'll work you like a mule building his ranch, and the moment you're no longer useful, he'll discard you. Then where will you be? Too old, too worn down, too far from civilization to matter to anyone." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the pompous, controlling man who'd made her life difficult, but someone genuinely limited by his own narrow worldview. "Tobias," she said gently, "I hope someday you meet a woman whose smallness makes you feel large, because that's clearly what you need. But I am not that woman. I will never be that woman, and I'd rather risk being used and discarded than live a safe, small life where my greatest accomplishment is being appropriately quiet." On her final evening in Salvation Springs, Eleanor stood in the empty schoolhouse one last time. The building felt hollow without the children's energy, without books on the shelves and maps on the walls. But it also felt lighter, as though her departure had released it from the weight of unfulfilled potential. "Goodbye," she whispered to the empty room. "I hope whoever comes next fights harder than I did." Lucas arrived at dawn with a wagon for her trunks and a gentle mare he'd borrowed for her to ride. "Her name's Bess," he said, helping Eleanor mount. "She's patient with new riders. Just trust her to know where to put her feet." Eleanor settled into the saddle, feeling awkward and exposed, but also unexpectedly exhilarated. From horseback, the world looked different, bigger, more open, full of possibility. As they rode out of Salvation Springs, Eleanor didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, on the mountains in the distance, on the trail that would lead her to Canyon de Chelly and whatever future waited there. Lucas rode beside her, comfortable in his silence, asking nothing of her except her presence. They'd been riding for perhaps an hour when he finally spoke. "You could still change your mind. I could take you to the stage station instead. Get you on a coach to Boston." Eleanor considered the offer, testing her certainty one final time. But the truth was, she felt more sure of this decision than she had of anything in years. "No," she said. "I made my choice. I'm going north." "Why?" Lucas asked. "Not that I'm complaining, but I'm curious what tipped the scales." Eleanor thought about Margaret Chen's wisdom, about Sarah's worried face, about 3 days of teaching without restrictions and remembering what education could be when it wasn't strangled by fear. Because in Boston, I'd be safe, but unnecessary, she said finally. I teach girls who have a dozen other options for education. But up north, if you're right about the scattered homesteads and families who need a school, there, I'd be necessary, needed, and I'd rather be needed doing hard work than decorative doing easy work. Lucas nodded slowly. That's a good reason. He paused. For what it's worth, I think you're remarkable. I've met a lot of people in my life, Miss Whitmore, but I've never met anyone quite like you. You see the world as it could be instead of just accepting it as it is. That's rare. That's valuable. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. Call me Eleanor. If we're going to be partners, we should probably use first names. Eleanor, Lucas tested the name, smiling. I like how that sounds. They rode on through the morning, the landscape opening up around them as they left the settlement behind. The desert was harsh and beautiful, unforgiving and magnificent. Eleanor had always loved it from the safety of town, but experiencing it directly, feeling the heat, tasting the dust, seeing the vast emptiness broken by sudden, startling life, was entirely different. Tell me about where we're going, she said. Not just the geography, the people, the community you want to build. And Lucas, who'd spent so many years keeping his dreams to himself, began to talk. He spoke about the land near Canyon de Chelly, about the families already homesteading there, about the Navajo communities and the possibility of peaceful coexistence. He talked about his vision for a ranch that was more than just a cattle operation, a place where people could gather, trade, learn, grow together. I've seen too many settlements fail because everyone only looks after themselves, he said. But I've also seen small communities thrive when people help each other, when they pool knowledge and resources. That's what I want to build, not just a ranch, a real community. Eleanor listened, her mind already racing with possibilities. A school that taught both Anglo and Navajo children. Adult education for homesteaders who'd never had the opportunity to learn. Perhaps even a library, small at first but growing over time. You're thinking, Lucas observed. I can see it on your face. What are you planning? Everything, Eleanor admitted. I'm planning everything. Lucas laughed, warm and genuine. Good. I was hoping you would. They rode until the sun was high and merciless, then stopped in the shade of some rocks to rest the horses and eat a simple lunch of bread and dried meat. Eleanor's muscles ached from the unfamiliar position of riding, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from doing something new and challenging. How long until we reach the herd? She asked. 2 more days if we keep a steady pace. Jennings will have them moving slow, grazing as they go. We should catch up around sunset the day after tomorrow. Lucas looked at her with concern. How are you holding up? We can stop more often if you need to. I'm fine, Eleanor said, and was surprised to find it was true. She was sore and tired and slightly sunburned, but she was also more alive than she'd felt in months, years, maybe. That night, they camped under stars so bright and numerous they seemed to crowd each other in their eagerness to be seen. Lucas built a small fire and made coffee so strong Eleanor could barely choke it down, laughing at her expression as she tried to hide her reaction. That bad? He asked, grinning. That's not coffee, that's liquid leather, Eleanor said, but she took another sip anyway, feeling the warmth spread through her. You'll get used to it, Lucas promised. Out here, weak coffee is considered an insult to the beans. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down. Lucas, Eleanor said eventually, what made you offer this to me? Really? I know what you said about wanting to learn and building a community, but there had to be other options, easier options. Lucas was quiet for so long Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he did speak, his words came slowly, thoughtfully. My mother could read, he said. Not well, but enough to get through a newspaper, write a letter. She taught herself mostly because her family thought education for girls was wasteful. She used to tell me that the saddest thing in the world was a bright mind trapped in a life too small for it. He poked at the fire with a stick. She died when I was 15, childbirth. But before she did, she made me promise something. She said, Lucas, when you're grown and making your own way, don't you ever dim someone else's light to make yourself feel brighter. And if you meet someone whose light is shining despite everyone trying to snuff it out, you protect that light. You give it room to burn. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. I'm sorry about your mother. So am I. Lucas looked up at her. But when I walked into that schoolhouse and saw you teaching those children, explaining things with so much passion and intelligence, and then I heard how this town was treating you, trying to dim your light because it made them uncomfortable. I don't know. I heard my mother's voice, and I thought, maybe this is what she meant. Maybe protecting your light and building my community could be the same thing. That's... Eleanor searched for words. That's the kindest thing anyone's ever done for me. Then people haven't been kind enough to you, Lucas said simply. Eleanor studied him across the fire, this unexpected man who'd ridden back 2 days to offer her freedom, who spoke of his mother's wisdom and light that shouldn't be dimmed. She barely knew him, but what she did know suggested a depth of character she'd rarely encountered. Teach me something, Lucas said suddenly. We have time before sleep. Teach me something I don't know. So Eleanor taught him about the stars, not just their names and positions, but the stories humans had told about them across cultures, the mathematics of their movements, the physics of their light reaching across impossible distances to illuminate their small campfire in the Arizona desert. And Lucas listened with the same focused attention he'd given to her map explanations, asking questions that showed he was thinking, connecting ideas, building understanding. When Eleanor finally lay down to sleep on her bedroll, the stars still brilliant overhead, she realized something that both terrified and thrilled her. She was happy. Genuinely, completely happy in a way she hadn't been since childhood. Not because her circumstances were perfect, they were actually quite uncertain, but because for the first time in her adult life, she was moving towards something instead of fighting against everything. Tomorrow they would ride further into unknown territory. The day after, they would reach the herd and the beginning of whatever life awaited her in the north. It was uncertain, it was risky, it was possibly foolish, but it was hers. Chosen freely, embraced fully, and that made all the difference. They reached the herd late on the second day, just as Lucas had predicted. Eleanor saw the dust cloud first, then heard the lowing of cattle, and finally spotted the campfires where the crew had settled for the night. As they rode closer, men looked up from their evening tasks, and Eleanor saw surprise register on their faces. Jennings was the first to approach, his weathered face breaking into a grin. Well, I'll be damned. You actually came back with her. Language, Jennings, Lucas said mildly, dismounting. We've got a lady present. A lady who's heard worse, I assure you, Eleanor said, accepting Lucas's help to dismount. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, muscles screaming from 2 days of unfamiliar riding. Lucas steadied her with a hand on her elbow. First long ride's always the hardest. You did well. Samuel Washington approached, removing his hat. Miss Whitmore, good to see you again. Sorry about what happened in that town. Thank you, Samuel. Though I'm beginning to think it was a blessing in disguise. That's a generous way to look at getting railroaded out of your job, one of the vaqueros said, but his tone was sympathetic rather than mocking. Over dinner, which consisted of beans, cornbread, and coffee that made Lucas's brew seem refined by comparison, Eleanor explained her arrangement with Lucas to the crew. She watched their faces carefully, looking for skepticism or disapproval, but found only interest and cautious optimism. A school up near Canyon de Chelly, Jennings mused. That could work. There's families scattered all through that territory. Most of them haven't seen a proper teacher in years, if ever. What about the Navajo? Eleanor asked. Lucas mentioned there are established communities in the area. How would they feel about an Anglo school on their land? The crew exchanged glances. Finally, Samuel spoke. That's a complicated question, miss. The Navajo were forced onto a reservation about 10 years back, then allowed to return to their traditional lands a few years ago. They're rebuilding, trying to maintain their ways while dealing with more and more settlers pushing into the territory. Some might welcome a school that teaches their children English and arithmetic, practical skills for dealing with the government and traders. Others might see it as another intrusion. Then I won't build anything without their consent, Eleanor said firmly. If I'm going to establish a school in that territory, it needs to serve everyone, not just Anglo settlers. That means working with the Navajo communities, learning from them, creating something collaborative rather than colonial. Lucas looked at her with undisguised admiration. That's exactly the approach I was hoping for. It's why I wanted you specifically. Someone who sees education as a bridge, not a weapon. Pretty words, Jennings said, but not unkindly. The reality will be harder than the theory, but if anyone can pull it off, I suspect you two might. That night, Eleanor lay in her bedroll looking up at the stars and thinking about the weight of what she'd undertaken. Building a school from nothing in contested territory, teaching children from multiple cultures with different needs and expectations, creating a community from scattered homesteads and wary neighbors. It was an enormous challenge, possibly an impossible one. But Eleanor had never shied away from difficult work, and for the first time in her life, she had a partner who seemed genuinely committed to helping her succeed rather than limiting her to make himself more comfortable. The herd moved slowly north, covering perhaps 15 miles a day. Eleanor rode with the crew, learning the rhythms of the cattle drive, asking endless questions about everything from reading weather signs to understanding bovine behavior. The men took turns answering her inquiries with a patience that surprised and touched her. Most folks don't care about the why of things, Samuel explained on the third day. They just want to know what works. But understanding why something works means you can adapt when circumstances change. That's valuable knowledge. Eleanor helped where she could, though she was still learning the basics of horsemanship and camp life. She gathered firewood, helped with meal preparation, and in the evenings she taught anyone who was interested. Some nights it was astronomy, other nights basic literacy for the two crew members who'd never learned to read properly. Sometimes it was just conversation, discussing ideas, sharing perspectives, exploring the world through words and wonder. Lucas participated in these evening sessions with an enthusiasm that both charmed and impressed Eleanor. He absorbed information like parched earth, absorbing rain, making connections between concepts, asking follow-up questions days later that showed he'd been thinking deeply about what she'd taught. "You're a natural student," Eleanor told him one evening after he'd worked through a particularly complex mathematical problem she'd posed. "I'm a motivated student," Lucas corrected. "There's a difference. I spent years knowing there were things I didn't understand, patterns I couldn't explain, questions I couldn't answer. Now I've got someone who can help me understand, and I'm not going to waste that opportunity." They were sitting slightly apart from the main campfire, their own small fire providing light for Eleanor's impromptu lesson. The intimacy of the moment, just the two of them, sharing knowledge in the vast darkness, felt significant in a way Eleanor couldn't quite articulate. "Can I ask you something personal?" Lucas said, setting down the slate she'd been using to demonstrate equations. "You can ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "In Salvation Springs, before all the trouble with the council, were you happy? I mean, setting aside how they treated you, did you like the work itself?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I loved the teaching. The moment when a child's face lights up because they've understood something new, when they make a connection between ideas, when they ask a question that shows they're really thinking, those moments made everything else worthwhile. But I was also frustrated constantly. Limited by what I was allowed to teach, by materials I didn't have, by expectations that had nothing to do with actual education." She paused. "Why do you ask?" "Because I want to make sure that what I'm offering you up north is actually better, not just different. If we're going to build a school, I want it to be the kind of place where you can do your best work, where you're not frustrated and limited. So I need to know what that looks like." Eleanor felt something warm unfold in her chest. "You're asking what I need to succeed." "Exactly." No one had ever asked her that before. People had told her what they needed from her, what they expected of her, what they'd allow her to do. But no one had ever simply asked what she needed. "Books," she said immediately. "A proper library, even if it starts small. Access to current scientific journals and educational materials. Time to develop curriculum without someone constantly looking over my shoulder disapproving. Students who are encouraged to ask questions rather than punished for curiosity. And she hesitated, then pushed forward. Respect. Not deference or special treatment, just basic respect for my expertise and my judgment." "Done," Lucas said simply. "I can't promise it'll all happen immediately. Books and journals cost money, and we'll need to establish the ranch before we can afford luxuries. But I can promise I'll work toward all of it. And the respect part, that's free, and it starts now." "You really mean that?" Eleanor said, studying his face in the firelight. I really do. Lucas met her eyes steadily. Eleanor, I'm not offering you this partnership because I need a school teacher for my ranch community. I'm offering it because I think you're brilliant and capable and exactly the kind of person who can build something extraordinary if given the chance. Your success is my success. Your growth benefits everyone. Why wouldn't I do everything in my power to help you thrive? Eleanor had to look away, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. She'd spent so long fighting for every scrap of opportunity, defending her right to simply exist as an educated woman, that genuine support felt almost incomprehensible. Thank you, she managed. That means more than you know. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead. Finally, Lucas spoke again, his tone lighter. So, what's next in my mathematical education? You've taught me basic algebra. What comes after that? Eleanor smiled, grateful for the return to safer conversational territory. Geometry, if you'd like. It has practical applications for surveying and construction, or we could explore more complex algebraic concepts. What interests you more? Geometry, Lucas said without hesitation. If I'm going to build a school and a ranch house and eventually other structures, I should probably understand the mathematics of construction. And so Eleanor began teaching him about angles and theorems, using sticks and stones to demonstrate principles, drawing diagrams in the dirt. Lucas absorbed it all with focused intensity, occasionally stopping her to make sure he understood a concept before moving forward. Watching him learn, Eleanor realized something that sent a flutter of anxiety through her stomach. She was developing feelings for this man, real, serious feelings that went beyond gratitude for his offer or appreciation for his mind. She admired his integrity, his curiosity, his willingness to listen and learn. She liked the way he looked at her, as though she was fascinating rather than troublesome. She enjoyed his company, their conversations, the easy partnership that was developing between them. This was dangerous territory. Eleanor had protected her heart for years, knowing that emotional attachment to men who would ultimately try to diminish her was a path to heartbreak. But Lucas was different. He'd proven that repeatedly. The question was whether she could trust that difference, whether she dared to risk vulnerability with someone who held so much power over her immediate future. The next morning brought unexpected complications. They'd crossed into territory that bordered Navajo lands, and as the herd grazed through a wide valley, a group of riders appeared on the ridge above them. Jennings immediately called for the crew to hold position. Nobody moves sudden, he said quietly. Lucas, you speak any Navajo? A little, Lucas said. Enough to be respectful, not enough to negotiate anything complex. I'll handle this, Jennings said, but you should come with me. Show we're not hiding anything. Eleanor watched as Lucas and Jennings rode slowly toward the Navajo riders, hands visible, posture non-threatening. The conversation that followed was too distant for her to hear, but she could read body language well enough to see initial wariness giving way to something more neutral. After nearly 20 minutes, Lucas and Jennings returned. They're scouts from a community about 10 miles west, Lucas explained to the gathered crew. They wanted to make sure we're just passing through, not planning to settle in this valley. I explained about the ranch land I'm purchasing further north, asked about water rights and grazing agreements. And, Samuel prompted, and they said we should talk to their headman before we start building anything permanent, which is exactly what I was planning to do anyway. Lucas looked at Eleanor. I also mentioned the school idea. One of the scouts has children. He seemed interested but cautious. As he should be, Eleanor said. I imagine Anglo schools haven't always served Navajo interests very well. That's putting it mildly, Jennings said. Government's been trying to force assimilation for years, taking children away to boarding schools where they're punished for speaking their own language, practicing their own customs. Can't blame folks for being suspicious of any school run by outsiders. Eleanor felt her determination solidify. Then we'll build something different. A school that respects Navajo culture while teaching practical skills. A place where children can be bilingual, bicultural, equipped to navigate both worlds without having to abandon either. The men looked at her with varying degrees of skepticism and hope. That's a fine ideal, Jennings said. Pulling it off will be the trick. They continued north for another week, the landscape gradually shifting from desert scrub to higher elevation grasslands. Eleanor could see why Lucas had chosen this territory for his ranch. There was water from seasonal streams and natural springs, good grazing, and enough elevation to provide relief from the worst summer heat. One evening, as they sat together after another geometry lesson, Eleanor brought up something that had been troubling her. "Lucas, you keep talking about this school and this community as though they're certainties, but we haven't actually secured permission from the Navajo leaders. We haven't finalized land purchases. We haven't even confirmed that families in the area want a school. What if none of this works out?" Lucas was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll adapt, find a different approach. Maybe the school needs to be mobile at first, traveling between homesteads. Maybe it needs to be part of something else, a trading post or a community center. Maybe we need to spend a year just building relationships before we build any structures." He looked at her seriously. "Eleanor, I'm not offering you a guarantee that everything will go according to plan. I'm offering you a partnership in figuring things out when they don't. Does that make sense?" "It makes sense," Eleanor said slowly. "But it's also terrifying. I'm used to having some structure, some certainty about my role and responsibilities. And how is that working for you in Salvation Springs?" The question was gentle but pointed. Eleanor laughed ruefully. "Fair point." "Look," Lucas said, "I understand being scared of uncertainty, but I think you're stronger and more adaptable than you give yourself credit for. You left everything familiar to ride into unknown territory with a man you barely know, based on nothing but possibility and hope. That takes tremendous courage." "Or tremendous foolishness," Eleanor said. "Sometimes they're the same thing," Lucas replied. "And sometimes you don't know which one it was until years later, when you can look back and see how it all turned out." The next afternoon, they finally reached the land Lucas had purchased. It was a beautiful sight, a broad meadow flanked by low hills, with a creek running through the eastern section and a stand of cottonwoods providing shade. Eleanor could already envision a schoolhouse under those trees, a ranch house on the slight rise overlooking the meadow, perhaps eventually other structures as the community grew. "What do you think?" Lucas asked, watching her face anxiously. "It's perfect," Eleanor said honestly. "Or it will be, once we build everything we're imagining." That night, Lucas called a meeting with the entire crew. "Jennings and I have been discussing timing," he said. "The original plan was to deliver the herd to the buyers up in Colorado, then return here to start building. But that's another month of travel, minimum. Miss Whitmore needs shelter before winter, and we need to establish contact with the Navajo communities and local homesteaders as soon as possible." "So what are you proposing?" Samuel asked. "I'm proposing I stay here with Miss Whitmore and 2 volunteers to start construction. Jennings takes the rest of the crew and the herd to Colorado, completes the delivery, and returns with supplies and whatever additional help he can hire. It means splitting our resources and manpower, but I think it's the best approach given our timeline." The crew exchanged glances. Finally, Jennings spoke. "It's risky. 3 people trying to build in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by folks who might not appreciate newcomers. But I see the logic." He looked around at the other men. "Who's willing to stay?" Samuel volunteered immediately. "I've done construction work before, and I'd like to see the school idea become real." One of the vaqueros, a quiet man named Miguel, raised his hand. "I can stay. My family homesteaded in Sonora. I know about building from nothing." And so it was decided. The next morning, Jennings and the rest of the crew prepared to move the herd north to Colorado. There were handshakes and well wishes, promises to return within 6 weeks with supplies and news. Eleanor watched them ride away with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She was now truly committed to this venture, with no easy way to retreat if things went wrong. Lucas seemed to read her thoughts. Having second thoughts? "Third and fourth thoughts, actually," Eleanor admitted. "But I'm still here. That's all I ask. One day at a time, one decision at a time." He turned to Samuel and Miguel. "All right, gentlemen, let's build a school." The first week was brutally hard work. They started with a simple dugout structure carved into the hillside, temporary shelter that would protect them from weather while they worked on more permanent buildings. Eleanor had never done physical labor like this before, and her hands blistered, her back ached, and she fell into exhausted sleep each night wondering if she'd been insane to think she could handle frontier life. But she also felt a fierce pride in what they were creating. Every stone they moved, every beam they raised, brought her school closer to reality. Lucas taught her as they worked, explaining construction principles, showing her how to judge if wood was sound, demonstrating how to use tools properly. It reminded Eleanor of their early conversations about maps and geography, the same patient teaching, the same assumption that she could and would learn. On the 8th day, they had visitors. A family from a homestead 5 miles east had seen their campfire smoke and come to investigate. Frank and Martha Reynolds had 3 children and a small farm they were trying to coax from the stubborn soil. "A school?" Martha said, her tired face lighting up. "A real school? Our children haven't had proper lessons in over 2 years." "It won't be ready for a few weeks yet," Eleanor cautioned, "and I'll need to assess what grade levels and subjects." "I don't care if you teach them under a tree," Martha interrupted. "The fact that you're here, that you're willing to teach at all, that's more than we've had." Frank was more cautious. "What are you charging for tuition?" Eleanor and Lucas exchanged glances. They hadn't actually discussed this aspect. "Nothing for the first year," Lucas said firmly. "After that, we'll figure out something fair based on what families can afford. Could be money, could be goods, could be labor. But no child will be turned away because their family can't pay." Frank's suspicion softened. "That's generous. Why?" "Because educated children become educated adults who build better communities," Eleanor said. "That benefits everyone, including me. I'm not doing this as charity. I'm doing it as investment in our collective future." The Reynolds family left with promises to spread word about the school and to return once it was ready. Over the next 2 weeks, more families visited. Some were enthusiastic, others skeptical, all of them desperate for the stability and opportunity that education represented. Eleanor began to understand the enormous need she was trying to fill. These were people living on the margins, barely surviving, with no access to books or learning or any of the cultural resources she'd taken for granted, even in Salvation Springs. For their children, this school might be the only chance at a different future. The weight of that responsibility was crushing and exhilarating in equal measure. 3 weeks into construction, Lucas arranged a meeting with leaders from the nearest Navajo community. Eleanor prepared carefully, asking Samuel and Miguel for advice on appropriate behavior, respectful greetings, cultural considerations she needed to understand. When the Navajo delegates arrived, 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in traditional clothing, all watching the newcomers with careful neutrality, Eleanor felt her heart hammer with anxiety. This moment would determine whether her school could truly serve everyone, or would be just another Anglo institution ignoring indigenous needs. Lucas handled the initial greetings in halting Navajo, then switched to English with one of the delegates serving as translator. He explained their purpose, establishing a ranch and a school, seeking permission to build on land that bordered traditional Navajo territory, offering education to any families who wanted it. One of the Navajo women, who introduced herself as Ayasha, spoke at length in Navajo. The translator conveyed her words carefully. She says Anglo schools have not been good for Navajo children. They teach that our ways are wrong, that our language is shameful, that we must abandon our culture to be acceptable. Why would this school be different? Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped forward. "May I speak directly?" Ayasha nodded, her dark eyes assessing Eleanor with an intensity that felt like being measured for worthiness. "I can't promise I'll do everything right," Eleanor said honestly. "I'm an outsider to your culture. I'll make mistakes, but I can promise that I'll listen, I'll learn, and I'll never ask children to abandon their heritage to gain knowledge. I believe education should add to who you are, not replace it." She paused, gathering courage. "I'd also like to learn from you, about your language, your history, your knowledge of this land. If we're going to share this territory, we should learn from each other, not just in one direction." The translator conveyed her words. Ayasha responded, and this time there was something less guarded in her expression. "She says you speak well, but words are easy. Actions will show truth." The translator paused. She asks, "Will you teach Navajo children and Anglo children together, as equals?" "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." Will you punish Navajo children for speaking their language? Never. In fact, I'd like to learn Navajo myself if someone would be willing to teach me. There was more discussion among the Navajo delegates, rapid exchanges in their language that Eleanor couldn't follow. Finally, Ayasha spoke again, and the translator smiled slightly. She says you may build your school. Navajo children will come if their parents choose to send them. But you will be watched. If you break your promises, if you harm our children with your teaching, you will be asked to leave. Do you accept these terms? I do, Eleanor said, and thank you. I'll do everything in my power to earn your trust. After the delegates left, Eleanor sat down heavily, trembling with released tension. You did well, Lucas said quietly. That was exactly the right approach. Honest, respectful, willing to be held accountable. I meant every word, Eleanor said, but now I have to live up to it. I have to create a school that actually honors those promises. You will, Lucas said with quiet confidence. I've watched you teach. You have a gift for meeting students where they are, for making them feel valued while challenging them to grow. That's exactly what's needed here. Eleanor looked at him, this man who believed in her capabilities more than she sometimes believed in herself. Lucas, why do you have so much faith in me? We barely know each other. Lucas smiled. I know enough. I know you're brilliant and dedicated and brave enough to risk everything for what you believe in. That's more than enough to build on. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Eleanor found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something she was still afraid to name. Then Miguel called out that they needed help with a beam placement, and the moment passed. But it lingered in Eleanor's mind as they worked through the afternoon, as they ate dinner around the campfire, as she lay in her bedroll that night looking up at the stars. She was developing feelings for Lucas that went far beyond partnership or gratitude. She was falling for him, for his integrity, his vision, his unwavering support of her dreams. The question was what to do about it. They'd agreed their relationship would remain professional unless something developed naturally. But what did natural mean? How did you navigate attraction when you were building something together, when your futures were already entangled in complex ways? Eleanor fell asleep without answers, but with a growing certainty that sooner or later she and Lucas would have to address what was developing between them. And when that conversation came, it would determine not just their personal relationship, but the entire future they were trying to build together. The schoolhouse took shape slowly over the next 3 weeks, rising from the earth like a promise being kept. It was simple. One large room with windows facing east to catch the morning light, a stone fireplace for heat, rough-hewn benches that would serve as desks. But to Eleanor, it was the most beautiful building she'd ever seen, because every board and nail represented possibility unfettered by small-minded restrictions. She was hammering wooden pegs into the bench frames when a rider approached at full gallop. Lucas looked up from the roof beam he was securing, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the wall. But it was just a boy, maybe 14, on a lathered horse. He pulled up hard, breathing nearly as heavily as his mount. "You the teacher, lady?" he gasped. Eleanor set down her hammer. "I am. What's wrong?" "It's my sister. She's real sick. Mama says it might be the fever that took the Henderson baby last month. Pa rode to Fort Defiance for the doctor, but that's 2 days there and back, and Jenny's getting worse." The boy's voice cracked. "Mama heard you know about science and medicine and such. Please, miss. Can you come?" Eleanor's stomach dropped. She'd studied human anatomy and basic medical principles, but she wasn't a doctor. She had no formal training, no medicines, no guarantee she could help. "I'm not qualified," she began. "Please." The boy's eyes were desperate. "You're all we've got." Lucas had climbed down from the roof. "How far?" 6 miles west. The Morrison homestead. "Saddle Bess," Lucas told Eleanor. "I'll get the medical kit and some supplies." "Lucas, I don't know if I can—" He gripped her shoulders gently but firmly. "You know more than nothing, and right now that family needs someone who knows more than nothing. We'll figure it out together." 20 minutes later, Eleanor was riding west with Lucas and the Morrison boy, her mind racing through everything she'd ever read about fevers and childhood illnesses. The problem was that her knowledge was theoretical, gleaned from medical texts, never applied to an actual suffering child. The Morrison homestead was even more desperate than Eleanor had imagined. A rough cabin, struggling crops, evidence of poverty that made Salvation Springs look prosperous. Inside, a woman who couldn't have been more than 30 but looked 50 sat beside a pallet where a small girl lay frighteningly still. "Thank heaven you came," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice hoarse from crying. "She's been like this since dawn. Won't wake up, won't drink water. I don't know what to do." Eleanor knelt beside the child, forcing herself to project calm she didn't feel. The girl was perhaps 6 years old, her skin hot and dry, her breathing shallow and rapid. Eleanor placed her fingers against the girl's neck, feeling for a pulse. Too fast. Much too fast. "How long has she had the fever?" Eleanor asked. 3 days. Started with a headache and chills, then the fever came on. I tried cold compresses, willow bark tea, everything I know, but nothing's working." Eleanor examined the child more carefully, looking for rashes, checking her eyes and throat, palpating her abdomen gently. The girl moaned but didn't wake. "Lucas, I need cool water, clean cloths, and any willow bark or feverfew we have in the supplies." Eleanor tried to remember everything she'd read about managing high fevers. "Mrs. Morrison, has she had any seizures? Any bleeding from the nose or ears?" "No, nothing like that, just the fever getting higher and higher." Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities. The lack of rash ruled out some contagions. No seizures was a good sign, but the dangerously high fever and the child's unresponsiveness were terrifying. "We need to bring the fever down," Eleanor said, more to herself than anyone else. But too quickly could be dangerous. Gradual cooling, fluids if we can get her to swallow, and she hesitated, then made a decision. "We need to try to wake her. The longer she's unconscious, the more dangerous this becomes." For the next 4 hours, Eleanor worked with focused intensity, drawing on every scrap of knowledge she possessed and improvising the rest. She and Lucas took turns sponging the child with cool water, careful not to chill her too rapidly. They managed to get small amounts of willow bark tea into her mouth, drop by drop. Eleanor talked to the girl constantly, calling her name, asking her questions, trying to pull her back to consciousness. Mrs. Morrison hovered anxiously. "Is she going to die? Please tell me straight. Is my baby going to die?" Eleanor wanted to lie, to offer false comfort, but this woman deserved honesty. "I don't know," she said quietly. "The fever is very high, but she's young and she was healthy before this. If we can break the fever in the next few hours, she has a good chance. But I can't promise anything. I'm not a doctor." "You're doing more than I could," Mrs. Morrison said. "That's all I can ask." As evening approached, Eleanor was exhausted and beginning to despair. The child's fever remained dangerously high despite all their efforts. She looked at Lucas, who'd been supporting her tirelessly, and saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. "There's one more thing I can try," Eleanor said. "I read about it in a medical journal, but I've never seen it done. It's risky." "What is it?" Mrs. Morrison asked. "An alcohol rub. We use strong spirits to cool the skin more effectively than water alone. But if I do it wrong, if I use too much or leave it on too long, it could harm her." "And if you don't try?" Lucas asked quietly. Eleanor looked at the child's flushed face, at her labored breathing. "Then I think we'll lose her." Mrs. Morrison's face crumpled, but she nodded. "Do it. Do whatever you think might help." Eleanor carefully mixed the alcohol with water, testing the ratio on her own skin to make sure it wasn't too harsh. Then, with hands that trembled slightly, she began applying the solution to the child's arms and legs, watching anxiously for any adverse reaction. For 10 minutes, nothing changed. Eleanor continued the treatment, her heart sinking, preparing herself to tell this desperate mother that she'd failed. Then the child stirred. It was slight, just a small movement of her hand, but it was the first voluntary motion she'd made in hours. "Jenny?" Mrs. Morrison leaned forward. "Baby, can you hear me?" The girl's eyelids fluttered. Her lips moved, forming soundless words. "Keep talking to her," Eleanor urged. "Call her back." Mrs. Morrison took her daughter's hand, speaking softly, urgently, telling her about the chickens waiting to be fed, about her brother missing her, about all the things they'd do together when she was well again. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the child's eyes opened. She looked confused, unfocused, but conscious. "Mama?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Morrison burst into tears. Eleanor quickly checked the girl's temperature again, feeling the fever beginning to break at last, sweat forming on skin that had been dangerously dry. "The fever's breaking," Eleanor said, her own voice unsteady with relief. "She's not out of danger yet, but this is good. This is very good." Over the next hour, they coaxed water and broth into the child, changed her sweat-soaked clothes, and watched as her breathing gradually steadied and slowed to something closer to normal. By the time the moon rose, Jenny Morrison was sleeping naturally, her fever down to something manageable, her color improving. "You saved her," Mrs. Morrison said, gripping Eleanor's hands. "You saved my baby." "We don't know that yet," Eleanor cautioned. "She needs rest and fluids and careful watching. When your husband returns with the doctor, I don't care what the doctor says. You saved her. I saw her slipping away, and you brought her back." Mrs. Morrison looked at Eleanor with something like awe. "You really are going to build a school here?" "Yes. Once the building is finished, probably another 2 weeks. Then my children will be in your classroom every single day, and I'll tell every family within 20 miles what you did here tonight. You'll have more students than you can handle. Mark my words." Eleanor and Lucas rode back to their camp under a sky full of stars, both of them too exhausted to speak for the first few miles. Finally, Lucas broke the silence. "You were remarkable tonight. I've seen men face down stampedes with less courage than you showed in that cabin." "I was terrified the entire time," Eleanor admitted. "I kept thinking about everything that could go wrong, all the ways I might make things worse. But you didn't let the fear stop you. That's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it." Lucas paused. "Eleanor, you need to know something. What you did tonight, what you're building with this school, what you're trying to create here, it matters. It matters more than you probably realize." There was something in his voice, an intensity that made Eleanor's heart skip. "Lucas, I know we agreed to keep things professional," he continued, the words coming faster now, as though he'd been holding them back for weeks and couldn't contain them any longer. "I know the plan was to build the school and the community first, and maybe, someday, if we both felt the same way, we might consider something more. But Eleanor, I can't keep pretending what I feel for you is just partnership or friendship or professional respect." Eleanor's breath caught. They'd stopped their horses without her realizing it, and now they sat facing each other in the moonlight, the enormity of the moment settling around them like snow. "I'm in love with you," Lucas said simply. "I think I've been falling in love with you since that first afternoon in the schoolhouse, watching you explain cartography with so much passion and intelligence. Every day since then, every conversation, every time I watch you teach or see you push through difficulty or witness you refusing to be anything less than exactly who you are, I fall a little more. And I know this is terrible timing. I know we're in the middle of building something important, and adding romantic complications could jeopardize everything. But I also can't keep this to myself anymore. You deserve to know where I stand." Eleanor sat frozen, her mind spinning. She'd known her feelings for Lucas were growing, had suspected his feelings might be developing similarly, but hearing him say the words out loud made everything suddenly intensely real. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything right now," Lucas said quickly. "I'm not asking for an answer or a decision. I just needed you to know. Because living this close to you, working beside you every day, watching you be brilliant and brave and beautiful—" He stopped, color rising in his cheeks even in the moonlight. "I couldn't keep pretending it was just professional interest. That wouldn't be honest. And if we're building something together, it needs to be built on honesty." Eleanor's throat was tight with emotion. "Lucas, She stopped, trying to organize the chaos of her feelings into coherent words. "I care for you too, more than I've allowed myself to admit, but I'm also terrified." "Of what?" "Of losing myself." The words came out raw, vulnerable. Every relationship I've ever seen, every marriage in Salvation Springs, every couple I've encountered, the woman always becomes smaller. She gives up her dreams, her identity, her autonomy to support her husband's ambitions. And even though you say you want me to be myself, even though you've done nothing but support my work, I'm terrified that's what will happen anyway. That I'll wake up 5 years from now and realize I've been slowly erased. Lucas absorbed this quietly. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but serious. I can't promise you that relationship dynamics won't change over time. I can't guarantee we won't have conflicts or disagreements or moments where we have to compromise. But Eleanor, I can promise you this. I will never ask you to be less than you are. I will never see your intelligence or your ambition or your independence as threats. Your growth doesn't diminish me. Your success doesn't compete with mine. I genuinely believe that both of us becoming more fully ourselves makes whatever we build together stronger, not weaker. How can you be so sure? Eleanor asked. How do you know you won't wake up one day resenting me for being too educated, too outspoken, too much? Because I've had 28 years to figure out what I value, Lucas said, and I've learned that I don't want someone who makes me feel powerful by being powerless. I want a true partner, someone who challenges me, who makes me think, who pushes me to be better. That's you, Eleanor. You make me want to learn and grow and build something meaningful. Why would I ever resent that? Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. In Boston, I have a guaranteed position, security, a community of educated women. I could build a life there where my intellect would never be questioned. I know, Lucas said, and I wouldn't blame you for choosing that. It's safer, more certain. What I'm offering is harder, building from nothing, navigating cultural tensions, dealing with isolation and difficulty. But Eleanor, in Boston, you'd be one teacher among many, following someone else's curriculum, fitting into someone else's vision. Here, you could create something entirely new, something that reflects your values and your dreams. Isn't that worth the risk? The question hung between them, enormous and unavoidable. Eleanor thought about the Boston letter, still tucked carefully among her belongings. She thought about the Reynolds children, desperate for education, about little Jenny Morrison, saved by knowledge applied with courage, about Ayasha and the Navajo delegates, willing to trust her if she proved trustworthy, about the school taking shape under the cottonwood trees, waiting to be filled with students and learning and possibility. And she thought about Lucas, this unexpected man who'd offered her not a smaller life but a larger one, who'd never asked her to diminish herself, who seemed to genuinely believe that her success and his could grow together rather than compete. I'm still scared, she said finally. Even if everything you're saying is true, even if we build something beautiful together, there are no guarantees. What if it fails? What if the school doesn't work, or the community doesn't develop the way we hope, or the Navajo decide we're not trustworthy after all? What if I give up Boston for this, and it all falls apart? Then we'll have tried, Lucas said. We'll have taken a risk on something meaningful instead of playing it safe. And Eleanor, failure isn't the worst thing that can happen to a person. Regret is worse. Spending your life wondering what you might have built if you'd been brave enough to try, that's worse than failure. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the weathered cowboy who'd wandered into her schoolhouse seeking a map, but the man who'd ridden 2 days to bring her back, who'd worked tirelessly to build her school, who'd stood beside her through every challenge, who'd fallen in love with her mind before her face and valued her dreams as much as his own. I choose this, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. I choose the hard path with you. I choose building something new over fitting into something established. I choose uncertainty and possibility over security and limitation. Lucas's face transformed, hope and joy and relief flooding his features. Are you sure? No, Eleanor admitted. I'm terrified and uncertain and have no idea if we'll succeed. But I'm also more certain about this than I've been about anything in years. So yes, I'm choosing this. I'm choosing us. Lucas dismounted and helped her down from Bess, and then they were standing face to face in the moonlight, the enormity of what they'd just committed to settling around them. Can I kiss you? Lucas asked, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor answered by closing the distance between them, rising on her toes to meet his lips with hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning this new aspect of their relationship. Then it deepened, becoming more confident, more certain, a physical confirmation of the commitment they'd just made to each other. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. We're really doing this, he said, wonder in his voice. Building a school, building a community, building a life together. We really are, Eleanor confirmed. And I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm doing it anyway. Lucas laughed, the sound full of joy. That's the spirit of the frontier right there. Jumping in without knowing if you'll swim or sink, but being willing to find out. They rode the rest of the way back to camp in comfortable silence, hands occasionally brushing, both of them processing the shift in their relationship. When they reached their campsite, Samuel and Miguel were still awake, working by firelight on window frames for the schoolhouse. The Morrison girl? Samuel asked immediately. Fever broke, Eleanor said. She should recover fully. Miguel smiled. Good. The territory needs more people who can think and act under pressure. You'll make an excellent teacher, Miss Whitmore. Thank you, Miguel. And please, call me Eleanor. Later, lying in her bedroll looking up at the stars, Eleanor thought about the choice she'd made. She'd given up Boston, the security, the prestige, the guaranteed success. She'd committed to building something from nothing in difficult territory with a man she'd known for barely 2 months. It was possibly the most irrational decision she'd ever made. It also felt absolutely right. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of construction and preparation. Word of Eleanor's work at the Morrison homestead spread quickly, and families began stopping by regularly, some to check on the school's progress, others to meet the teacher who'd saved Jenny Morrison's life. Still others to ask medical questions Eleanor did her best to answer with appropriate disclaimers about her limited training. You've become the unofficial doctor as well as the teacher, Lucas observed one evening after Eleanor had spent an hour advising a mother about treating her son's persistent cough. That's a lot of responsibility. It's terrifying, Eleanor admitted, but I can't turn people away when they need help and have nowhere else to go. I just wish I had more actual medical training instead of just book knowledge. Maybe that's something we add to the community eventually, Lucas suggested. A proper clinic, a trained doctor or nurse. Right now we're building the foundation, the school, the ranch, the relationships with neighbors. But as we grow, we can add more. The schoolhouse was nearly complete when Jennings returned with the rest of the crew and a wagon full of supplies. He took one look at Eleanor and Lucas standing close together, their body language unmistakable, and grinned. Well then, looks like more than just the school got built while I was gone. Eleanor felt herself blush, but Lucas just smiled and put his arm around her shoulders. Eleanor and I have reached an understanding. We're partners in every sense of the word now. About damn time, Samuel said, slapping Lucas on the back. We all saw this coming from the moment he rode back for you in Salvation Springs. The crew had brought more than just supplies. They'd brought news of families in Colorado interested in homesteading in the territory, of traders willing to establish roots through the area, of growing interest in the region as more people looked for land and opportunity. There's something else, Jennings said, his tone becoming more serious. I ran into a group from Salvation Springs when I stopped in Albuquerque for supplies. Apparently your sudden departure caused quite a stir, Miss Whitmore. The town council hired a new teacher, but she quit after 2 weeks. Couldn't handle the restrictions and the interference. Now they're without a school at all, and some of the families are angry about it. Eleanor felt a complicated mixture of vindication and sadness. I hope they find someone who can work within their limitations. Those children deserve education, even if the adults running the town don't understand what real education looks like. There's more, Jennings continued. That Caldwell fellow, the one who was bothering you, he's apparently been telling people you ran off with a cattle drover to live in sin, that you're a fallen woman who abandoned her moral responsibilities. Eleanor felt anger flash through her, but before she could respond, Lucas spoke, his voice hard. Let him talk. We know the truth. The people here know the truth. Whatever lies a bitter man tells in a town we'll never see again don't affect what we're building here. Actually, Eleanor said slowly, an idea forming, maybe we should address this directly. Not for Salvation Springs' benefit, but for ours. Lucas, what if we formalized our partnership legally? Not necessarily marriage right away, but a business contract that clearly defines our arrangement, our joint ownership of the school and ranch, our mutual responsibilities. That way, regardless of what Caldwell or anyone else says, we have legal documentation of our professional relationship. Lucas looked at her with surprise and growing admiration. That's brilliant, practical and strategic. It's also protective, Eleanor continued. If something happened to you, I'd want legal claim to continue the school, and vice versa. If something happened to me, you should have clear rights to continue building what we've started together. This isn't just about defending against gossip, it's about creating legal security for what we're building. Jennings nodded approvingly. Smart thinking. I can draft something basic, have it notarized next time I'm in Albuquerque. Won't be as solid as a lawyer's work, but it'll be better than nothing. That evening, Eleanor and Lucas sat down to work out the details of their partnership agreement. It was a strange kind of intimacy, discussing property rights and financial responsibilities and contingency planning, but it also felt profoundly important. They were building something that would outlast both of them, and giving it legal structure made it real in a way that even the physical schoolhouse didn't quite achieve. If we do decide to marry eventually, Lucas said carefully, this agreement stays in place, right? I don't want marriage to somehow erase your legal claim to what you've built. Eleanor looked up from the notes she was making, touched by his consideration. Lucas Reed, are you proposing to me? Not yet, he said with a smile. But eventually, yes. When the time is right, when we're both ready, I absolutely intend to ask you to marry me. And when I do, I want to make sure you know that marriage won't diminish your independence or your legal rights to what we've created together. Then when you do eventually ask, Eleanor said, I'll very likely say yes. But you're right. Let's make sure the legal structure protects what we're building, regardless of our personal relationship status. 2 days before the school's planned opening, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. Ayesha arrived with 3 other Navajo women carrying baskets and bundles. We have brought gifts for the school, Ayesha said through the translator. Blankets for the children to sit on, dried herbs for medicine. And, she gestured to one of the younger women, my daughter Desba will teach Navajo language and traditions to any students who wish to learn. Eleanor felt tears of gratitude well up. That's incredibly generous. Thank you, all of you. Ayesha studied Eleanor intently. You kept your word. The school serves all children equally. You learned some of our language. You treat our people with respect. She paused. This is good. We will support this school. The women stayed for several hours, helping Eleanor organize the schoolroom, sharing their knowledge about local plants and their medicinal uses, discussing what Navajo children would need to learn to navigate both their traditional world and the changing Anglo world encroaching on their territory. As they prepared to leave, Desba approached Eleanor shyly. I am nervous to teach. What if the Anglo children do not respect our knowledge? Then I'll make sure they understand that respect for all knowledge is a requirement in this classroom, Eleanor said firmly. Your culture has wisdom that's been tested over generations. That deserves the same respect as anything from my textbooks. When Lucas returned from checking the ranch's water sources that evening, Eleanor told him about Ayesha's visit and Desba's agreement to teach. This is exactly what we hoped for, Lucas said, pulling her into an embrace. A real community school, not just an Anglo institution transplanted to the frontier. Eleanor leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the certainty that she'd made the right choice in every possible way. I'm still scared, she admitted. Tomorrow the school opens for real, and I have no idea how many students will show up or whether I can actually pull this off. You'll be magnificent, Lucas said with complete confidence. And even if everything goes wrong tomorrow, we'll figure it out together. That's what partners do. That night, Eleanor barely slept, running through lesson plans in her mind, worrying about logistics, questioning every decision she'd made in the past months. But when dawn came and she stood in the doorway of the completed schoolhouse, watching families approach from multiple directions, Anglo homesteaders, Navajo children with their parents, even the Morrison family with Jenny looking healthy and excited, Eleanor felt something settle in her chest. This was her calling, not teaching privileged girls in Boston who had every advantage, not fighting feudal battles with small-minded councils in towns that would never change, but this, building education from nothing, creating bridges between cultures, offering possibility to children who desperately needed it. Lucas came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. Ready? He asked. Eleanor looked at the schoolhouse, at the families gathering, at the vast Arizona territory stretching in every direction, full of challenges and possibilities in equal measure. "Ready," she said, and stepped forward to greet her students. 23 students showed up that first day. Eleanor had prepared for perhaps a dozen, optimistically hoping for 15. Instead, she found herself facing children ranging from 5 to 16 years old, representing at least 4 different language backgrounds, with educational experiences spanning from complete illiteracy to surprisingly advanced reading skills. It should have been chaos. By all reasonable expectations, Eleanor should have been overwhelmed, drowning in the impossibility of teaching such a diverse group with limited materials in a brand new building that still smelled of fresh-cut wood. Instead, she felt alive in a way she'd never experienced in Salvation Springs. "Welcome, Chtas," she said, standing before her students with her heart pounding but her voice steady. "My name is Miss Whitmore, and this is our school. Not my school, our school. Because what we build here, we build together." She looked at each face. Anglo children with sunburned noses and darned clothes, Navajo children watching her with cautious curiosity, the Morrison children, including little Jenny, who waved enthusiastically, 2 Mexican siblings whose family had recently homesteaded 5 miles south. Some of you speak English as your first language. Others speak Navajo or Spanish or are learning all 3. Some of you can already read, and some of you are just beginning. None of that matters. What matters is that you're here, ready to learn, and I promise you this. In this classroom, every language is valued, every question is welcome, and every student matters equally. A hand shot up. It was one of the Navajo boys, perhaps 10 years old. "Yes?" Eleanor prompted. "My father says Anglo schools punish children for speaking Navajo. Will you do that?" The room went silent. Every Navajo child was watching her intently, as were several of the Anglo children who seemed curious about her answer. "Never," Eleanor said firmly. "In fact, we're going to do something different here. We're going to learn from each other. I'm going to teach you reading and writing in English, mathematics, science, history. But Miss Desba," she gestured to the young Navajo woman sitting quietly in the back corner, "is going to teach all of us about Navajo language and culture. Because knowledge flows in many directions, and we're all students and teachers at the same time." She saw surprise and approval ripple through the room. Even Desba looked stunned and pleased. The first day was organized chaos, but it was productive chaos. Eleanor assessed each student's abilities, organized them into flexible groups based on skill level rather than age, and began the careful work of building a classroom community from children who had little in common except their presence in this room. By the time she dismissed them that afternoon, Eleanor was exhausted but exhilarated. Lucas was waiting outside, having watched the final hour through the window while pretending to work on the ranch house foundation. "How did it go?" he asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. "It was terrifying and wonderful and completely overwhelming," Eleanor said, sagging against him. "I have no idea what I'm doing, but I think we're actually going to make this work." "Of course you are," Lucas said, kissing her forehead. "I never doubted it for a moment." The first weeks of school were a learning experience for everyone. Eleanor developed a system where older students helped teach younger ones, creating a cooperative environment rather than a competitive one. Desba's language and cultural lessons became a highlight of each day, with Anglo children fascinated by Navajo stories and traditions, while Navajo children gained confidence seeing their heritage treated with respect and interest. Eleanor also discovered that teaching on the frontier required a flexibility she'd never needed in Salvation Springs. When one of the homesteading families needed all hands for harvest, their children missed a week of school, so Eleanor prepared packets of work they could do in the evenings and adjusted her lessons to accommodate their absence. When winter storms made travel dangerous, she held lessons for whichever children could make it safely and sent materials home with them for their siblings. The community began to coalesce around the school in ways Eleanor hadn't anticipated. Parents started gathering after they dropped off their children, exchanging news and assistance. Martha Reynolds organized a lending library using books donated from various households. The Morrison family, still grateful for Eleanor's help with Jenny, provided fresh milk and eggs for students who came to school without breakfast. Lucas's ranch was thriving as well. With Jennings managing much of the daily cattle operation, Lucas had time to work on building the ranch house and establishing relationships with neighboring homesteaders and Navajo communities. He and Eleanor fell into an easy rhythm, working separately during the day, coming together in the evenings to share meals and conversation, planning their future with a mixture of practicality and dreams. 3 months into the school year, Eleanor received a letter that had been forwarded through multiple locations before finally reaching her. It was from the Boston Ladies Educational Society, inquiring about her decision regarding their teaching offer. She read it sitting at her desk after school had dismissed, remembering the woman she'd been when she first received their invitation, that Eleanor had been desperate for escape, willing to travel 3,000 miles to find a place where her education wouldn't be seen as a character flaw. This Eleanor had built that place herself. She wrote back that evening, declining their generous offer, but thanking them for the opportunity. She also included a detailed description of the school she'd established, the multicultural curriculum she was developing, and the challenges of frontier education. Perhaps, she suggested, their society might be interested in supporting such efforts with donated books and materials. "Are you sure?" Lucas asked, reading over her shoulder. "Boston would be easier in many ways, more resources, more support, less daily struggle." "I'm absolutely sure," Eleanor said. "I don't want easier. I want meaningful. And this..." She gestured to the schoolhouse visible through their window, to the ranch taking shape around them, to the vast territory beyond. "This is the most meaningful thing I've ever done." Lucas wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Have I mentioned lately that I'm in awe of you?" "Not since this morning," Eleanor said, leaning back into his warmth. "But I never tire of hearing it." Winter brought new challenges. Snow made travel difficult, and several students couldn't attend regularly. Eleanor adapted by riding to distant homesteads when weather permitted, bringing lessons and materials directly to families who couldn't make the journey to school. Lucas accompanied her on these trips, and together they became fixtures in the scattered community, the teacher and the rancher who were building something new. It was during one of these winter visits that Eleanor had a conversation that would change everything. They'd stopped at a Navajo settlement to drop off materials for Desba's younger siblings. While Lucas discussed cattle and grazing rights with the men, Eleanor sat with a group of Navajo women who were working on traditional weaving. Ayasha was there, her skilled hands moving the shuttle with practiced ease. "You have done well with the school," she said in carefully pronounced English. "My grandson speaks of his lessons with excitement. This is good." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "Desba has been invaluable. The children love learning from her." "She grows in confidence," Ayasha agreed. "Teaching has been good for her." She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. "There is something we have been discussing among the women, a proposal we would like to make to you." Eleanor waited, intrigued. Many Navajo women hold knowledge about plants, about healing, about the land and seasons. This knowledge has been passed down for generations. But with so many changes, with the young people needing to understand both the old ways and the new ways, we worry this knowledge will be lost. Ayasha's hand stilled on the loom. What if there was a way to record this knowledge, to write it down so it can be preserved and shared? Eleanor's mind immediately began racing with possibilities. "Are you suggesting a documentation project, recording traditional knowledge in written form?" "If it can be done respectfully," Ayasha said. "Not to replace oral teaching, but to support it, so that if our elders pass before they can teach everything, the knowledge does not die with them." "I would be honored to help with such a project," Eleanor said carefully, "but it should be controlled by your community. You should decide what gets recorded, how it's recorded, who has access to it. I could teach writing and documentation methods, but the knowledge itself belongs to you." Ayasha smiled, the first truly warm smile Eleanor had seen from her. "This is why we trust you. You understand that knowledge has ownership, has sacred aspects. Many Anglo people do not understand this." Over the next several months, Eleanor worked with a group of Navajo women and elders to develop a documentation system for traditional knowledge. It was painstaking work, requiring careful translation and cultural sensitivity, but it was also profoundly rewarding. Eleanor learned as much as she taught, gaining deep respect for the complexity and sophistication of Navajo knowledge systems. Lucas supported the project enthusiastically, providing materials and helping to build relationships with neighboring Navajo communities who became interested in similar documentation efforts. "This is bigger than just our school now," he observed one evening as Eleanor worked on transcribing medicinal plant knowledge. "This could preserve cultural knowledge across the entire region." "It could," Eleanor agreed. "And it's all because Ayasha and her community were willing to trust me, willing to take a risk on collaboration instead of isolation." "Just like we did," Lucas said quietly. Eleanor looked up from her work, meeting his eyes. "Exactly like we did." Spring brought a surprise visitor. Eleanor was teaching an advanced mathematics lesson to her older students when a well-dressed woman appeared in the schoolhouse doorway. She was perhaps 50, with silver-threaded hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Miss Whitmore?" the woman inquired. "I'm Dr. Catherine Harrison from the Territorial Education Board. I've heard quite extraordinary things about your school, and I wanted to see it for myself." Eleanor's heart began to pound. The Territorial Education Board had the power to certify or close schools, to provide funding or withhold it, to legitimize educational efforts or condemn them as inadequate. "Of course," Eleanor said, maintaining her composure. "Please observe as long as you'd like. Children, continue working on those equations. I'll be circulating to check your progress." Dr. Harrison spent the entire day watching the school in action. She observed Eleanor teaching mathematics and science, watched Desba lead a language lesson, noted how older students helped younger ones, examined the curriculum materials and student work samples. She asked pointed questions about methodology, assessment, and educational philosophy. By the time school dismissed, Eleanor was exhausted from the scrutiny and terrified of what judgment might follow. "Miss Whitmore," Dr. Harrison said as the last students departed, "I need to be frank with you. When I received reports about your school, I expected to find either a desperate attempt at frontier education or an idealistic disaster. What I found instead is one of the most innovative and effective educational programs I've encountered in my 20 years with the board." Eleanor stared at her, unable to process the words. Dr. Harrison continued, "Your multicultural approach, your flexible grouping, your integration of traditional knowledge with standard curriculum, your emphasis on student collaboration, these are all methods that educational theorists in the East are just beginning to discuss. Yet you've implemented them successfully here, with limited resources and no formal institutional support." "I just did what seemed to work for my students," Eleanor said weakly. "Exactly. You adapted to need rather than forcing students to adapt to rigid systems. That's brilliant teaching." Dr. Harrison paused. "I'd like to recommend your school for territorial certification and funding. I'd also like to invite you to present your methods at our annual educational conference in Santa Fe this fall. Other teachers in the territory could learn tremendously from what you've built here." After Dr. Harrison left, Eleanor sat in the empty schoolhouse, overwhelmed. Lucas found her there an hour later, staring at the wall with a dazed expression. "What happened?" he asked, immediately concerned. Eleanor told him about Dr. Harrison's visit and evaluation, her voice still shocked. "She said we're innovative. She wants to fund the school and have me present at a conference. Lucas, I don't understand. I thought we were just barely making this work, and she acts like we've created something extraordinary." Lucas pulled up a chair beside her, taking her hands. "Eleanor, you did create something extraordinary. You've built a school that serves children from multiple cultures with different needs and backgrounds. You've preserved traditional knowledge while teaching modern subjects. You've created a community center that brings people together instead of dividing them. Just because you're too close to see how remarkable that is doesn't make it less true." "But I'm not doing anything special," Eleanor protested. "I'm just teaching this way that makes sense, adapting to what my students need." "And that's exactly what makes it special," Lucas said gently. "Most teachers force students to adapt to one rigid system. You've created a system that adapts to students. That's revolutionary, even if you don't see it that way." That evening, as they sat together planning improvements for the school with the anticipated territorial funding, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion. Not that her work was finished, there would always be more to do, more students to teach, more methods to refine. But she'd found her place, her purpose, her path forward. "Lucas," she said suddenly, "I want to marry you." He looked up from the plans he'd been sketching, startled. What? I want to marry you, Eleanor repeated, more confidently. Not because it's expected or because we should formalize our partnership legally. We already did that. But because I love you, and I want everyone to know that we're building this life together by choice, not just by circumstance. Lucas's face broke into a smile that could have illuminated the entire territory. Eleanor Whitmore, are you proposing to me? I believe I am, Eleanor said, laughing. Is that terribly improper? It's perfect, Lucas said, pulling her into his arms. And yes, absolutely yes, I would be honored to marry you. They were married in early summer, in a ceremony that reflected the community they'd built together. The wedding took place outside under the cottonwood trees near the school, with families from Anglo homesteads and Navajo settlements gathered together. Jennings officiated, Samuel and Miguel stood as witnesses, and Desba sang a traditional Navajo blessing. Eleanor wore a simple dress she'd made herself, practical but pretty. Lucas wore his best clothes, his weathered hands gentle as he took her hands in his. I promise to be your partner in all things, Lucas said, his voice carrying to the assembled crowd. To support your dreams as I pursue my own. To never ask you to be less than you are. To build a life where both of us can grow. I promise to build with you rather than for you, Eleanor replied, tears of joy on her cheeks. To trust you with my vulnerabilities and my strengths. To create a partnership where love and independence coexist. To keep learning and growing alongside you for as long as we both live. Martha Reynolds had organized a celebration afterward, with food contributed by dozens of families, music provided by a homesteader who played fiddle, and dancing that continued until the stars filled the sky. Late in the evening, Eleanor and Lucas slipped away from the festivities, walking to the school that had brought them together. Do you ever regret it? Eleanor asked, leaning against Lucas as they stood in the doorway of the building they'd created. Leaving the cattle drive life for this? All the complications and challenges of building a community? Not for 1 second, Lucas said firmly. I traded temporary freedom for permanent purpose. That's not a sacrifice, that's growth. I keep thinking about the woman I was in Salvation Springs, Eleanor mused. So angry, so defensive, so convinced that I had to fight the world alone to protect my right to exist as myself. And now? Now I know that partnership doesn't have to mean surrender, that I can be fully myself and fully committed to someone else at the same time. That love doesn't require shrinking, it can actually create space for expansion. She turned to look at him. You taught me that, just by being exactly who you are. You taught me something too, Lucas said. I spent years assuming that because I lacked formal education, I was somehow less capable of understanding complex ideas. You showed me that intelligence isn't about credentials or schooling. It's about curiosity and willingness to learn. You gave me back my confidence in my own mind. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the celebration continue in the distance, both of them contemplating the path that had brought them to this moment. The school year that followed their marriage was the most successful yet. With territorial funding, Eleanor was able to purchase proper textbooks, scientific equipment, and materials for both traditional curriculum and the cultural documentation project. The student body grew to 38 children, requiring Eleanor to hire an assistant teacher, a young woman from Santa Fe who'd heard about the school's innovative methods and wanted to learn from Eleanor. The ranch thrived as well, becoming known throughout the territory for quality cattle and fair dealing. Lucas and Jennings expanded the operation, hiring additional hands and establishing the ranch as an economic anchor for the scattered community. But perhaps more importantly, the community itself flourished. The school became a gathering place, not just for children, but for adults who wanted to learn to read, for families who needed medical advice, for neighbors who wanted to trade goods and share news. The Navajo settlements and Anglo homesteads, once wary of each other, began to cooperate more readily, finding common ground in shared concerns about water rights, grazing land, and the education of their children. Eleanor's presentation at the Santa Fe Educational Conference was a triumph. Teachers from across the territory were fascinated by her multicultural approach and her methods for accommodating diverse student needs with limited resources. Several asked if they could visit her school to observe her methods firsthand. You're becoming famous, Lucas teased when she returned home with letters from a dozen teachers requesting visits. I'm becoming useful, Eleanor corrected. There's a difference. 2 years after their marriage, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated mixture of joy and fear. She'd seen too many women disappear into motherhood, their other identities and ambitions swallowed by the demands of child-rearing. Lucas found her sitting by the creek one evening, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, her expression troubled. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling beside her. "I'm thinking about my mother," Eleanor said quietly. She was educated too. She loved books and learning. But after she married and had children, all of that stopped. She became just a wife and mother, nothing more. And I could see in her eyes sometimes that she missed who she used to be. "Are you afraid that will happen to you?" Lucas asked gently. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "I love teaching, I love the school and the documentation project and the work we're doing. But I also know how demanding a baby will be, how easy it would be to let everything else slide while I focus on keeping a tiny human alive." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, then said, "What if we plan for it differently? What if, instead of expecting you to do everything yourself, we built a system where you could be both a mother and a teacher? I could take on more childcare than most fathers do. We could hire additional help. We could make the school flexible enough to accommodate a teacher with a baby." "That's not how things are typically done," Eleanor said. "When have we ever done things typically?" Lucas countered. "We built a multicultural school in the middle of contested territory. We created a partnership based on equality when everyone said it was impossible. We're documenting indigenous knowledge when most people think it's not worth preserving. Why would we suddenly start following conventional rules about parenting?" Eleanor felt hope kindle in her chest. "You'd really be willing to be more involved with childcare than most men?" "Eleanor, I'm willing to split it completely equally if that's what you need. Our child deserves to know both parents. You deserve to continue the work you love. And I happen to think I'd be a pretty good father if given the chance." He paused. "Besides, imagine what kind of education our child would receive, growing up in that schoolhouse surrounded by multiple cultures and languages, learning from both traditional knowledge and modern science." The baby, a daughter they named Claire, was born the following spring. And true to his word, Lucas was an involved, engaged father who took on his share of childcare without resentment or expectation of praise. Eleanor took a month away from teaching immediately after the birth, then returned to the classroom with Claire in a cradle beside her desk. The students were fascinated by the baby, and Eleanor discovered that having an infant in the classroom actually enhanced certain lessons. Teaching about child development became hands-on observation. Discussing nutrition and health became immediately relevant. Even mathematics took on new meaning when calculating how much a baby grew each week. Claire grew up bilingual in English and Navajo, learning from Desba as readily as from Eleanor. She took her first steps in the schoolhouse, said her first words to a classroom full of delighted students, and developed a confidence and curiosity that made both her parents proud. 5 years after Eleanor first arrived in the territory, the school had become a permanent fixture. The building had been expanded twice to accommodate growing enrollment. Eleanor had trained 3 assistant teachers who went on to establish similar programs in other parts of the territory. The cultural documentation project had expanded to include 5 different Navajo communities and had attracted interest from anthropologists and educators across the country. The ranch was equally successful, providing economic stability for the family and employment for several local people. Lucas had become a respected leader in the community, known for fair dealing and innovative approaches to ranching that worked with the land rather than against it. One evening, Eleanor and Lucas sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching Claire play in the yard with Samuel's children. The sun was setting over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you remember that first conversation in the Salvation Springs schoolhouse?" Eleanor asked. "When you just wanted a map and I ended up explaining coordinate systems?" Lucas laughed. "I remember thinking you were the most fascinating person I'd ever met, also slightly terrifying. You had this intensity when you talked about geography, like it was the most important thing in the world." "It was important," Eleanor said, "because it meant someone was actually listening to me instead of tolerating me or trying to shut me up." "I'm glad I listened," Lucas said. "Best decision I ever made walking into that schoolhouse." "Second best," Eleanor corrected. The best decision was coming back for me after the council fired me. That's when everything changed. You would have been fine in Boston, Lucas said. Probably would have built something remarkable there, too. Maybe, Eleanor agreed. But it wouldn't have been this. It wouldn't have been ours. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the territory they'd helped shape spread out before them. This land that had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving had become home, had become the foundation for a community that was truly innovative in its inclusivity and its approach to education and cultural preservation. Eleanor thought about the letter she'd recently written to Margaret Chen in Salvation Springs, updating her on the school's success. Margaret had written back with news that the town had finally found a teacher willing to stay, though the curriculum remained restrictive and uninspired. But Sarah Chen, now 15, was planning to apply to the territorial teaching program, inspired by the education she'd received in Eleanor's classroom during those brief months before everything changed. Some seeds took time to grow, Eleanor reflected. Some changes happened slowly, almost invisibly, before suddenly becoming undeniable. Eleanor, Lucas said suddenly, I need to tell you something. She turned to look at him, concerned by his serious tone. I know we built this together, he continued. I know I contributed the land and the labor and the community connections. But I want you to understand this is yours. The school, the documentation project, the reputation you've built as an innovative educator. That's all because of who you are and what you've created. I was just lucky enough to provide the opportunity. Lucas, that's not... Let me finish, he said gently. In Salvation Springs, they told you that you were too educated, too intelligent, too much. They made you believe that being yourself was a liability. But Eleanor, being exactly who you are, brilliant and stubborn and endlessly curious and absolutely unwilling to make yourself smaller, that's what made all of this possible. Your refusal to shrink is what allowed everything here to grow. Eleanor felt tears well up. You know what the most remarkable thing is? I'm not the same person I was in Salvation Springs. I'm more myself, because you gave me space to expand instead of pressure to contract. That's the gift you gave me, Lucas. Not opportunity, not land, not even love. Though those all matter too. You gave me permission to become more fully myself than I ever could have been alone. We gave that to each other, Lucas said, taking her hand. I'm a better man, a better thinker, a better person, because you challenged me to learn and grow. This partnership worked because we both believed the other deserved to thrive. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd left Salvation Springs believing she was fleeing judgment and limitation, but really, she'd been running toward possibility, toward a life where her education was an asset rather than an obstacle, toward a partnership based on mutual respect and shared dreams, toward a community that valued knowledge and growth over conformity and limitation. The woman who'd stood before the Salvation Springs Council, trembling with fury at their rejection, would hardly recognize this Eleanor. That woman had been defensive, isolated, convinced she had to fight the world alone to maintain her identity. This Eleanor knew that she didn't have to choose between love and independence, between community and individuality, between being herself and being accepted. She could have all of it, as long as she chose partners, in life, in work, in community, who understood that her growth enhanced rather than threatened what they built together. Claire ran up to the porch, breathless and grass-stained. Mama, tell me the story again about how you and Papa met. Eleanor pulled her daughter onto her lap, catching Lucas's eye over Claire's head. Well, she began, once upon a time there was a teacher who knew too much, and a cowboy who wanted to learn everything. And as Eleanor told the story of maps and conversations, of courage and choices, of building something new from nothing but possibility and partnership, she realized this was the lesson she most wanted to pass on. Not mathematics or science or geography, though those all mattered, but this understanding that you could be fully yourself and fully connected to others. That knowledge was meant to be shared, not hoarded. That the best communities were built not by everyone being the same, but by everyone having space to be different. The school she and Lucas had created would continue long after they were gone. The cultural documentation project would preserve knowledge for generations. The community they'd helped build would adapt and grow, facing challenges they couldn't imagine yet. But the real legacy, Eleanor thought, wasn't buildings or programs or documented knowledge. It was the principle they'd proven through their lives together, that partnership didn't require surrender, that love could create space for growth, and that being too much for small-minded people just meant you were exactly right for building something extraordinary. As the night settled around them and Claire's questions finally wound down, Eleanor and Lucas sat together on their porch, hands entwined, looking out at the territory they'd claimed not through conquest, but through collaboration. They'd built a life that honored both of their dreams, a school that served an entire community, and a partnership that proved intelligence and independence could coexist with love and commitment. Eleanor had been told she was too educated for any man to want her. It turned out she'd just been waiting for the right man, one brave enough to say, "Teach me everything," and wise enough to grow alongside her rather than trying to contain her. And in teaching him, she'd learned the most important lesson of all, that the person you are isn't something to apologize for or diminish. It's the foundation for everything you can build, if you find the courage to remain yourself and the wisdom to choose partners who want you to flourish rather than shrink. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and constant. The territory stretched vast and full of promise in every direction. And Eleanor Whitmore Reed, once deemed unmarriageable for the crime of being educated, sat beside the man who'd loved her not despite her brilliance, but because of it, knowing that she'd finally found the place where she could be everything she was meant to be: teacher, scholar, wife, mother, community builder, and most importantly, herself.